Hello, welcome back. You're watching BBC News with me, Sean Lay. We'll have much more reaction and analysis on the European Parliament election results in the UK and around the European Union. First, though, let's get all the day's sport from Jane Dougal. Afternoon, Jane. Jane, thank you very much. Jane Dougal there at the BBC Sports Centre. Right, back to the European Parliament election results. We have almost all of the UK results in. We're just waiting for Northern Ireland to declare. Let's take a look at the share of the vote. With 11 out of 12 nations and regions declared, it's the Brexit Party which has gained the largest share, almost 1/3. It's on 32%. The Liberal Democrats took second place with 20%. That's up 13 points on the previous elections 5 years ago. Labour came third with 14%, down 11 points on 2014. The Greens increased their support. They gained 12%. That's their best performance since the late 1980s in European elections. The Conservatives fell to an historic low. They took just 9% of the vote, putting them in fifth place. UKIP, Mr Farage's former party, fell heavily, took just 3%, as did the new Change UK party. So neither of them making an impact in these elections that would reward them with any seats in Brussels and Strasbourg. Well, 73 seats in all were up in the European Parliament. Brexit Party, because of that share of the vote, took 29%. Remember, these are proportional elections, and they're done on a regional basis. So the share of the vote is pretty much reflected in the number of seats. They had just one in 2014. Labour have 10 MEPs, losing 8. The Greens more than doubled their seats, with some MEPs up 4. I should say, when I said 1 seat, that was the Liberal Democrats had 1 seat and have gone up. The impact on the Conservatives couldn't be clearer. They've got just 3 MEPs, down 15. The Nationalist Party has also picked up seats, with the SNP winning 3 seats, and Plaid have won 1 seat after beating Labour in Wales. Well, Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage said the result sends a message to Conservatives and Labour to deliver on the 2016 referendum result.
Well, it was launched 6 weeks ago, and in that very short space of time, we've managed to top the polls and win a national election, and win it comfortably. So, look, we're very, very pleased that we were able to do this in such a short space of time. But I think this shows the real sense of frustration out there. You know, we didn't just vote in a referendum to leave the EU. We voted for political parties in the general election of 2017, both of whom said they'd deliver. They didn't. March the 29th was embedded in people's minds as the date we left the European Union. We didn't, and that's why the Brexit Party's here. They broke their promises, and parties that break promises do badly in elections. That's the lesson from last night. But it's also fair to say this applies to a lot of Labour voters too. Labour promised to honour the result of the referendum. They are now moving rapidly towards being a party that wants a second referendum. And if you look in South Wales, particularly parts of the north of England, you'll see that the Brexit Party was actually picking up more support from the Labour Party there than it was from the Conservatives. We are the biggest party in the European Parliament, coming from the whole of Europe, and what we want to do is play an active role, take some responsibility. We have got a mandate now, and we want the government to include us in their negotiating team. We have got to get ready for leaving the European Union on October the 31st. There's an awful lot we can do. The Liberal Democrats are the leading Remain party. They want to overturn the result of the referendum. That's their position. Our position in the Brexit Party is we want a clean break Brexit so that we are a genuinely independent country. They're the two positions, and frankly, if you try and do a bit of both, if you try to give us Brexit in name only, then in the end, nobody will be satisfied. And really that I suppose history will say that is Mrs May's legacy. She tried to please everybody, she pleased nobody. Brexit is a fork in the road. It's a big, massive constitutional decision. We've made that decision and we deserve to have it delivered. If we win, we win. And I should be very pleased, because one thing I know for certain is if we'd left the Labour and Conservative parties on their own, there was zero prospect of us getting a proper, clean Brexit. If we can make it happen, and make it happen quickly, I would be delighted. But I do, though, think British politics is now about more than just leaving the European Union. Yeah.
Nigel Farage there speaking a little earlier this morning. We're hoping, incidentally, I should say, to hear from Mr Farage again. He's expected to hold a news conference later this afternoon. We also hope to hear from the Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Vince Cable. The Lib Dems finished second with around 20% of the vote, up 13 points on their very disappointing performance in 2014 when they were reduced to just one MEP. Well, earlier, Joanna Gosling, who spent the morning at Westminster, spoke to the party's Brexit spokesman, the Liberal Democrat MP Tom Brake, and asked him if this had changed anything for his party.
Well, in reality, it's true that the European elections, in terms of the numbers of MPs in House Commons, hasn't changed anything. But I think what is clear is that the vote that's just taken place was no ringing endorsement, for instance, of no deal, and therefore I think it will renew the vigour of members of Parliament, like the Liberal Democrats and in other political parties, who are going to do everything they can to block no deal, but also to secure a people's vote, which I think for any future Conservative Prime Minister is the only way out of this almighty mess that they have created.
It comes back though again, doesn't it, to that 31st of October deadline, and is there actually anything like the time frame that would be needed to have a second referendum and to continue with these debates? We're heading for no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October.
Well, there is still just time. We reckon a referendum could be delivered in 20 weeks. But even if that is not the case, then the European Union have indicated that as long as the UK is engaged in a democratic process with a clear outcome, which would be the case with a referendum where people are choosing between the deal, at the moment it's only Theresa May's deal, there isn't any other on offer, or staying in the European Union. If the EU know that we're engaged in that process, I'm absolutely confident they give us an extension to enable that people's vote to take place sometime after the 31st of October.
It would be risky though, wouldn't it? Because it could end up with just as unclear a picture, and then we've extended, and then where are we?
Well, it is risky in that there's no guarantee that the outcome of that referendum, for instance, would support the position that I want, which is voting to stay in the European Union. However, I think that is a perfectly legitimate democratic exercise, because now, 3 years after the Brexit vote, some clarity is emerging over what Brexit means, and that's why I think it should be put to that test.
And do you support no-deal Brexit being on the ballot paper in a referendum?
Well, we've always said that no deal, a no deal will be a catastrophe for the United Kingdom. The government's own analysis confirmed that. Businesses confirm that.
But should it be on the referendum, on the paper?
Well, I think that the deal that has been agreed is what should be on the ballot paper, and that's the position that we're fighting for at present. Having no deal on the ballot paper with all of the economic consequences associated with that, which the government has spelled out, would be irresponsible.
Sorry, I mean, you did very well overnight, obviously, but the Brexit Party did better. And in terms of democracy, if there's a referendum, could you really say that there shouldn't be the opportunity for those who voted for the Brexit Party last night to say we do want to leave without a deal?
Well, we're not yet at the stage, unfortunately, of deciding what the question on the ballot paper is going to be, but certainly what would need to be tested is if the government do come forward with no deal and say, oh, well, the result 3 years ago, that was an endorsement for no deal. I completely disagree with that. No one 3 years ago was arguing that no deal was on offer. On the contrary, they're all saying a fantastic, brilliant deal was on offer. Then we would most definitely have to put that to the test.
That was the Liberal Democrat MP Tom Brake talking to Joanna Gosling a little earlier. Well, the two largest UK parties have suffered heavy losses. Labour has finished overall in third place with 10 MEPs and around 15% of the vote. Its worst ever showing in the European Parliament election. There have been calls from senior figures within the party, including the Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry and the party's leader in Wales, Mark Drayford, to commit to another referendum. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said the party would have further discussions about its Brexit policy.
What we'll do is consult members and through the constituency parties and affiliated trade unions and bring the issue back to conference in September.
Don't you have an obligation now to listen to this result and listen to the impact in your heartlands and actually have a second referendum and a clear position to back Remain?
We're listening very carefully to what everyone has to say on this subject. The country is clearly very divided. Farage and the Brexit Party don't offer any agreement with the EU, merely a crashing out, which will cause chaos for jobs and services across this country. I think we do have a responsibility to listen to what everyone has to say and ensure that there is an agreement made, and that is then put to a public vote.
Do you concede that your slightly ambiguous position over Brexit has meant, as some have said, that you're essentially riding the two horses and you've fallen flat on your face?
Not at all. What we've tried to do is bring people together. Whether they voted Leave or Remain, they still face problems of a Tory government in disintegration, austerity and poverty across this country. What we've done is tried to bring people together and point out that in the future there has to be a trade relationship with the European Union. Otherwise, many jobs are at risk. Farage wants to privatise the NHS and have a no-deal exit from the European Union. I'm not quite sure how that helps people's problems.
These are not good results for the Labour Party, and people are saying because there hasn't been clarity, you've lost votes to the Brexit Party and obviously Liberal Democrats. Is there an answer to that today?
The answer is we listen to our members, we listen to our supporters, we listen to the public. The answer is also we take the fight to the Tories to end austerity in this country, to rebuild our health service and our social services, to invest in good quality jobs for the future. That has to be the right way forward. The country needs to come together to face our problems together.
Emily Thornberry last night suggested that further compromise talks are over and that your party needed to firmly commit to a second referendum and campaign for Remain. Do we have that today from you?
What you have from me today is a commitment that our party is listening to its members and its supporters and reaching out to other parties across the House of Commons to prevent a crashing out from the European Union with no deal. A commitment that the future will of course be put to a public vote, as we have already proposed in Parliament, and indeed colleagues, including Emily, voted alongside me in backing that request.
Just finally, John McDonnell this morning talked about the fact there needs to be a public vote. Can you clarify what he means by that? Is that a general election or is that actually a referendum?
The priority at the moment, I think, is for this government to call for a general election and actually have a general election so we can decide the future. It has no majority in Parliament, it has no legislative programme, and Parliament is basically been given nothing to do by the government. I think that is a demand that should be made and made as strongly as possible. John has also pointed out, and I support this, that any final deal has to be put to a public vote, and that we're prepared to do, and indeed support it.
But from here on in, the dividing line's quite clear. If people want to know what you stand for, can I get from you today that you would stand to be a party that support Remain and support a second referendum?
What this party does is supports an agreement with the European Union to prevent crashing out, supports putting that proposal, when agreed, to a public vote.
Jeremy Corbyn there. Right, let's take a look at the overall results across the rest of Europe and the spread of seats in the European Parliament. The big centre-right and centre-left blocs have lost their combined majority amid an increase in support for Liberals, Greens and Nationalists. Pro-EU parties are still expected, perhaps unsurprisingly, to be in a majority, but the traditional blocs will need to seek new allies. Liberals and Greens are likely, having had a good night, to be up for negotiations, while Nationalists were victorious in particular countries, Italy, France and of course the UK. However, the centre-right European People's Party remains the largest bloc. Analysts say it's likely to form a grand coalition with the Socialists, possibly supported by the Democrat bloc, which is sort of basically Liberal, the Liberals and the Greens as well. Negotiations and horse trading lie ahead. The first significant opportunity for that is dinner between the EU leaders on Tuesday night. Figures meanwhile, turnout was a surprise. Figures have risen to 51%. That's up from 42.5% in 2014. Turnout bucked a long trend of decline across the European Union. It was the best since 1994. Well, a little earlier, Ben Brown asked our Europe correspondent about that turnout and the implications of the results. Here's Gavin Lee.
More than 200 million people across Europe voting. And if you think back in 1979, where there were about 60% of voters going to the polling stations, that's dropped every single time there's been European elections up until this first year, bucking the trend, back around 50%, the highest it's been since 1999. I think there's a few things suddenly to just try to extrapolate why people suddenly vote. Europe has been on the agenda, front of people's papers, whether you love it, hate it, or somewhere in between, whether it's Brexit, the migration crisis, the Greek crisis, all of these things suddenly, it's been political rope-a-dope for the European Union for the past few years, with terrorist attacks across Europe added to that. It's been calmer for the past 2 years since the migration crisis ebbed in terms of the numbers coming, but actually Brexit's been the main thing on the agenda. And if you look, I was talking to a senior EU Council official last night who was saying that you can only fight so many political wars, and all of these things going on, actually now really there's only Brexit to deal with, and we have to see, for the EU point of view and the pro-EU stance, what is almost a passing tide of the Brexiteers, the Brexit Party being that highest party, single party of any national country now. EU fans and those within the Council Commission hope that passes by the end of October.
That's Gavin Lee reporting from Brussels. So the outcome of the European elections has reaffirmed the deep divide between supporters and opponents of the UK's planned exit from the EU. As the Brexit debate re-engaged voters, well, Vicky Holland has been speaking to some in Manchester.
Manchester on a bank holiday, the sunshine giving the city a continental feel. But Europe and the European elections wasn't everybody's focus.
To be honest, I don't know what the election's for. Is it for Brexit?
Not really.
No, is it?
It's to elect our MEPs.
No, I don't really mind about the result. I cared about Brexit, but not like who's in Parliament.
I didn't vote on Thursday. The reason why, because we're leaving, Europe and Brexit, I didn't see the point.
Last time it kind of passed me by a bit, really, so I felt like I had to do my duty and make sure I voted and got my point across.
In Manchester's former Central Railway station, the count got underway. The North West was previously split into loyal Labour heartlands, rural Conservative voters and strong support for UKIP. No more.
I therefore declare that the following candidates have been duly elected to the North West electoral region. Claire Regina Fox, the Brexit Party.
This time it was the Brexit Party who took the most seats, with UKIP nowhere to be seen.
None of us were aware that we were standing 4 weeks ago, so it has been incredible, and I really do think it's partly because the organisation of the Brexit Party, but it actually also is because people are really angry.
The Conservatives ended up with no MEPs at all. For those working at grassroots level, it's a hard result to swallow.
We've got a lot of flack on the doorstep with regards to what's going on in Westminster, and a lot of people saying that why should they vote, because it's not democracy anymore, is it? So there's a lot of people feel very disenfranchised with politics at the moment.
And even in the Labour heartlands of Manchester, the candidates were punished.
A disappointment that we haven't got through. We've got to re-engage with people that voted Remain. We've got to re-engage with people that voted Leave.
But for the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, it was a night to celebrate.
I have been a Trafford councillor for 19 years. I've been active in the Liberal Democrats for most of my life. It's an amazing time.
It's an absolute honour to be elected to represent the region, and I'm just so pleased that the voters in the North West have put their faith in the Green Party.
Here in the North West, like much of the country, it is the traditional parties who have suffered, Labour and the Conservatives. The Conservatives completely wiped out here. It is the Brexit Party who have taken 3 of the seats, but the Liberal Democrats have also done better than ever before, winning 2 seats in the North West.
And with some parties suggesting a general election is the only way to solve the problem of Brexit, the 2 big parties will have to work hard to clean up. Victoria Holland, BBC News, Manchester.
Now, here's something to confuse people in the southeast of England. 2 candidates with the same name, but from different parties, have been elected for that region. Alexander Phillips, MEP for Brexit, and Alexander Phillips, MEP for the Green Party. Reminds me of the time when there were 2 John Smiths who were both Labour Party MPs, more or less at the same time. It's time for a look at the weather now with Darren Bett.
Hello there. There's a bit of a chill in the air today. It's warm enough when the sun is out, but every now and again you may see clouds looking a little bit like this as the showers come rolling in. And it really is remaining mixed through the rest of the day. Some sunshine, some showers, which could be on the heavy side, and it will be feeling cooler as well. The most significant change in temperatures is going to be in the northeast of England, where with a northerly breeze today, temperatures are struggling to 11 or 12 degrees. Towards the southeast and East Anglia, it's 23 degrees yesterday, so a high here of 19 at best. Not too many showers along the south coast, the southwest of England, but quite blustery winds around here. Northerly winds coming in across Scotland, dragging down that colder air, and there are a sprinkling of showers across many parts of the country through the afternoon into the evening, and slowly easing down a bit across western areas overnight. Some clearer skies in Northern Ireland, and in rural parts it could be down to 3 or 4 degrees. Elsewhere, typically around about 6 to 8 Celsius. Now, Tuesday could be the chilliest day of the next few. We've got the colder air coming down on that north to northwesterly wind. By the time we get towards Wednesday, it's less cold air that's coming in from the Atlantic, but there'll be some cloud and some rain. For Northern Ireland, many western parts of Scotland, Wales, western areas of England, it may well be dry on Tuesday. There'll be more in the way of sunshine. Further east, particularly through the Midlands, eastern England, there'll be quite a few showers, and those could be heavy and thundery once again. And temperatures as a result will struggle to maybe 10 to 13 degrees. Further west and towards the southwest, 17 or 18. Gets chilly overnight, mind you, because this brief ridge of high pressure will kill off a lot of those showers. And then we drag in this Atlantic air. That means more cloud, higher humidity, and some outbreaks of rain too. There may be some early sunshine down the eastern side of the UK, but we're watching the cloud thickening from the west, some outbreaks of rain pushing across too. Not much rain at all in the southeast of England. Temperatures here still 17, maybe 18 degrees. Northern Scotland, though, seeing a mixture of sunshine and showers, not really getting that warmer air just yet, and not getting the rain, but it is going to be moving its way northwards. So through Thursday and Friday, we'll see the rain moving away from northern England, heading up into Scotland and Northern Ireland. Most places becoming dry over the weekend. Really warm in the southeast of England. Highs are likely to be in the mid-20s.
You're watching a BBC News EU election special with Carrie Gracie at Westminster and me, Sean Lay. The Brexit Party a clear winner. The Liberal Democrats take second place, and a very tough night for the Conservative Party and for Labour. Nigel Farage says he's ready to take on the biggest parties at Westminster after his Brexit Party took nearly a third of the vote and won 29 seats in the European Parliament.
We have got a mandate now, and we want the government to include us in their negotiating team. We have got to get ready for leaving the European Union on October the 31st. There's an awful lot we can do.
A successful night for the Liberal Democrats too. They campaigned to stop Brexit, and they came second overall with around 20% of the vote.
I'm Carrie Gracie at Westminster, where the two main parties have suffered heavy losses. The Conservatives are pushed into fifth place with a historic low of less than 10% of the vote. One minister says it is time to rethink their strategy.
It's a wake-up call to my colleagues in Parliament that we have to deliver on the instruction the British people gave us in 2016 in the Brexit referendum.
And pressure on Jeremy Corbyn to back another referendum after Labour falls to third place overall. He says the party's position remains unchanged.
What this party does is supports an agreement with the European Union to prevent crashing out, supports putting that proposal, when agreed, to a public vote.
We're going to bring you all the results this afternoon and set out the picture across Europe, where turnout is up and traditional parties have lost out to smaller ones. Hello, very good afternoon. Welcome to this BBC News special. In a major blow for the largest political parties at Westminster, the newly formed Brexit Party has emerged as the clear winner in the poll for the next European Parliament. Only launched recently, Nigel Farage's party won 29 seats in the elections on Thursday and received almost 1/3 of the share of the vote. Both Labour and the Conservatives posted some of their worst election results ever, with the Liberal Democrats taking second place on their anti-Brexit platform. Jeremy Corbyn, pressed by some senior Labour figures this morning to back another referendum, said the party's position hadn't changed, but it had a responsibility to listen and to ensure a public vote on any Brexit agreement was carried out. Well, only Northern Ireland still has to declare in the UK, so let's take a look at the results in detail so far. Brexit Party gained the largest share of the vote with 32%. Liberal Democrats took second place with 20% of the vote. That's up 13 points compared to the elections held 5 years ago. Labour came in third place overall. It had 14% of the vote, down 11 points. Greens increased their support. They gained 12% of the vote. It's pretty much their best performance in European elections in 30 years. The Conservative Party, though, fell to an historic low. They took just 9% of the vote, putting them in fifth place overall. In Scotland, the SNP dominated the poll with a big lead over the other parties. UKIP, which won the 2014 elections 5 years ago, well, they saw their vote fall heavily to just 3%, as the new Change UK party also failed to make an impact with only 3% of the vote share. Well, in total, 73 seats in the European Parliament were up for grabs for the UK representation. The Brexit Party now have 29 seats. The Liberal Democrats have 16. That's quite a change around from 5 years ago when they had just one. Labour has 10 MEPs, or will have 10 MEPs in the new Parliament when it sits next month. That's a loss of 8. The Green Party more than doubled its representation, 7 MEPs. That's up 4 on 2014. And the impact on the Conservative Party, well, it couldn't be clearer. They now have just 4 MEPs, down 15. In Scotland, the SNP won 3 seats, ending the career of the UK's longest-serving member of the European Parliament, David Martin for Labour, who'd sat there for 35 years. Well, while in Wales, Plaid Cymru have 1 seat after beating Labour there too. Counting in Northern Ireland got underway this morning. Our first report comes from our political correspondent Tom Barton, and a warning that his report does contain some flash photography.
Smiling faces for members of a party that was only launched 6 weeks ago. The Brexit Party, the clear winners of this election, taking almost a third of the vote and 29 MEPs. The party's leader saying that this could be just the start.
If we don't leave on October the 31st, then the scores you've seen for the Brexit Party today will be repeated in a general election, and we are getting ready for it.
It wasn't just a good night for the Brexit Party. Those standing on a clear Remain platform also made great leaps forward. The Greens beat the Conservatives into 4th place, while it was a champagne moment for the Liberal Democrats, coming in second with 20% of the vote.
This is the first time in 100 years that we've beaten both the Conservative and the Labour Party in the same election, and we are clearly able to demonstrate that both the Conservative and Labour Party did badly because they were absolutely split, couldn't articulate what they wanted on Brexit. We've been very clear we are the strongest Remain party.
The one thing that is clear from this result is that voters don't like the tightrope walk Brexit compromises that the two main parties have been offering up to now. What then does that mean for the future? Well, both for Labour and the Conservatives. It means that they're going to be under pressure to adopt simpler, clearer positions. For the Tories, devastation at the polls is likely to see leadership candidates taking even tougher positions.
This is the worst result in our party's history in elections. And it's a wake-up call to my colleagues in Parliament that we have to deliver on the instruction the British people gave us in 2016 in the Brexit referendum.
In Scotland, Labour has been wiped out in the face of an SNP surge, while in Wales, the party was forced into 3rd place. The pressure now on the leadership, including from some senior voices, to back another referendum. Jeremy Corbyn today promising to listen.
What you have from me today is a commitment that our party is listening to its members and its supporters and reaching out to other parties across the House of Commons to prevent a crashing out from the European Union with no deal. A commitment that the future will of course be put to a public vote, as we have already proposed in Parliament.
These results providing no easy answers for the parties when they return to Westminster next week. Tom Barton, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's go to Westminster now, and Carrie Gracie is there with the very latest reaction. Good afternoon, Carrie. You're there and the sun's come out again.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Sean. Now, as we've been reporting, tough night for both the Conservatives and Labour, and with the Tory leadership race already underway last night, likely to have a big impact on how Theresa May's prospective successor pitches their Brexit solution. But Labour also losing ground, and there are also questions as to what its future policy should be. So with me now, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. Vicky, we're hearing in that report a government minister there saying, wake up, we have to deliver or else.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a message Theresa May told them many times, wasn't it? But they didn't listen, many of them. And I think her hope was probably that when these election results happened, it would focus the minds of Tory MPs and Labour MPs to get her deal through. Of course, we're way past that. She has already left the scene. But the question is, I think, what impact will it have on that leadership contest? Because, of course, if you're a Tory leadership candidate looking at these, thinking Nigel Farage is the new enemy, isn't he? So are they then going to tack towards much more of a no-deal argument? That will be the temptation because, of course, it's the Tory grassroots who vote them into the position. And we know that they don't have so much of a problem with no deal. But in the end, it has to be something that can get through Parliament. And what these results do show us still is that the country is very split. Parliament is still very split. Always worth saying, though, that it's a turnout of 37%. There's another at least 30% of people who would normally vote in a general election. And, of course, we have no idea where their votes would go.
So that leaves a lot of uncertainties. But going back to the told you so type messages, they weren't just for the Conservative Party, they're also for Labour, because plenty of their senior figures have been saying, you sit in the middle of the road, you get squashed, you sit on the fence, it disintegrates underneath you, and to a certain extent they'll be saying I told you so.
Yeah, and they're getting themselves in a bit of a tangle about all of this. You could just see last night the tweets that were coming from Labour MPs in Northern Heartlands which voted Brexit. They felt that they were losing support to the Brexit Party. In the South, in seats in London particularly, you have people like Emily Thornberry saying, no, this is all about us not being clear about the possibility of a second referendum. Now, when it comes to that, we've had Jeremy Corbyn there constantly talking about a people's vote, but suggesting that could mean a general election, so not entirely clear. But we have caught up with John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, today, and this is what he said about the possibility of another referendum.
So we're faced with the prospect of a no deal, which could have catastrophic consequences for our economy. A Tory leader being elected on that basis, no matter what the damage to jobs in the economy. So we've got to prevent that. How do we do that? Well, of course we want a general election, but realistically, after last night, there aren't many Tory MPs that are going to vote for a general election. It'll be like turkeys voting for Christmas. So our best way of doing that, I think, is going back to the people in a referendum, and I think that's what our members want. So we're saying quite clearly, if there can be a deal, great, but it needs to go back to the people. If it's a no deal, we've got to block it. And the one way of doing that is, I think, going back to the people and arguing the case against it.
Well, John McDonnell there, and I suppose for everybody the message seems to be more clarity, and you have to just take a cost. You've just got to decide where the cost is.
Yeah, well, the clarity came from the Brexit Party, very clearly saying we just need to get out. We can get out without a deal, that's fine. And on the other side, the Liberal Democrats very clearly saying we want another referendum, we want to stop Brexit. Equally, the Greens. They are the parties that benefited. But it is a massive problem for people like Labour. You could hear there, I mean, John McDonnell seemed to be saying, I read that as him saying a referendum in any circumstances. And actually, Welsh Labour have broken ranks as well, saying now exactly the same thing. They say it doesn't matter. We just need to go back to the people with whatever the outcome is. And Welsh Labour saying we would clearly, in that case, campaign to remain.
Vicky, I know you keep us posted with developments during the course of the afternoon. One last thing before I let you go. This is very high.
You can still hear him.
Yeah, absolutely. See you later. And that's it for me now. We'll go back to Sean and we'll talk to you again shortly.
Carrie, what a shame he doesn't yodel. Let's take a look at the overall results across the rest of Europe and the spread of seats in the European Parliament. Now, the big centre-right and centre-left blocs, they've traditionally dominated the European Parliament. Their combined majority has been lost amid an increase in support for Liberals, Greens and Nationalists. Pro-EU parties still expected to be in a majority, but the traditional blocs will have to seek new allies. Liberals and Greens had a good night. Nationalists too were victorious, particularly in Italy, France and of course here in the UK. However, the centre-right European People's Party, that's the party to which the British Conservatives used to be allied until David Cameron took them out a few years ago, that remains the largest bloc, and analysts say it's likely to form a grand coalition with the Socialists and Democrats. with support from Liberals and Greens. Negotiations horse trading lie ahead. They'll begin when the European Union heads of government meet for dinner on Tuesday night to analyse the results. Turnout in these elections was a surprise. The number of people voting rose to 51%, up from 42.5% 5 years ago, bucking what's been a long trend of decline in voter numbers actually across the European Union, and the best since 1994. Well, our Europe correspondent Damian Grammaticus reports now on those results.
Across Europe, one of the surprises of these elections, Green parties. This was Germany, where they surged into second place. Germany's result mirrored the picture Europe-wide. The traditional centre, Conservative right, Social Democrat left, on the slide, Greens and others profited. So now the Greens are being courted by those old parties looking for their support.
People are talking to us. Obviously, they are keen to have the Greens around the table. And so if we are invited around the negotiating table, we'll go there.
And it's possible the centre-right under pressure might now fragment further.
It's a totally new situation, a totally new setup, and I really believe, I'm convinced, that the vote of the European citizens has a clear message that European Union must be reformed in order to be strong again.
For the Greens and all the other parties, how their national results translate into power here in the European Parliament is through the alliances they can forge. And what's clear there is that the surge some predicted for far-right anti-EU forces hasn't materialised. That didn't mean any real celebrations for Emmanuel Macron's party in France. It was beaten just by Marine Le Pen's far-right EU sceptics. But it wasn't a decisive win for her. Her share of seats may actually have fallen. It was Matteo Salvini's far-right League in Italy that was a big winner. However, his allies elsewhere in Europe stumbled, losing seats, limiting his influence. So the most significant gains of all may have gone to the Liberals. Their candidate might now be in with a chance of securing the top EU job on offer, President of the European Commission.
The monopoly of power is broken. And this is, of course, why we can do something else.
Overall, then, the EU's centre under pressure has held firm, but change may still be coming.
Damian Grammaticus there reporting from Brussels. Well, in Germany, major gains were made by the Greens at the expense of both parties in the governing coalition, the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's party, and the Social Democrats. Damien McGuinness is in Berlin and he's been looking at those results. Just first of all on the Social Democrats, Damien, they seem to have had a dreadful night, not just in European Parliament elections.
Yeah, they're really struggling. So this is the party that is allied with Angela Merkel's Conservatives, but their left-wing grassroots and their left-wing members don't want to be in government, frankly. They're blaming this close embrace with the Conservatives for their appalling poll numbers and the dreadful results they've seen in this European election, but also in previous state elections over the past year or two. And there's growing pressure now on that party to break away from the government, to quit the coalition, which would bring the German government down. Now, it's unlikely that's going to happen over the next few weeks, but we've got other key state elections here in Germany over the next few months, in the autumn in particular, and the centre-left SPD, the Social Democrats, are expected to do really badly there too. If that happens, it's almost inevitable that this government may not see its full term. So that has a number of implications, clearly within Germany in particular, but also EU-wide, because it would mean that you'd need fresh elections in Germany. And the news from these European elections, the bad news, particularly for the centre-left SPD, but also for Angela Merkel's party, the Christian Democrats, means that it's even more likely that this government in Berlin won't see out its full term.
I mean, the implications as well are serious in terms not just of the SPD, the opposition, but as you say, the ruling Christian Democrats. Angela Merkel already on a slow exit. Some have speculated, I saw it in the Irish press again only at the weekend, that she might be the best hope for Europe in a new role as President of the European Commission. Is there any thought in Berlin that that's a serious prospect?
About once a week we get a rumour that that's going to happen, and every time she rejects it. So we've had it. We have it regularly. She's been suggested as this person going for the top job or one of the top jobs in Germany. She's denied anything of the sort. So she said that she will not stand for a top EU job. We're going to have more rumours like this over the next few months and no doubt, and she'll have to deny them again. What this does show is this result is a big blow for her party, not necessarily for Angela Merkel herself, though, because she wasn't really present in these EU elections. She really has taken over this more like presidential role. She's floating above politics at the moment. It doesn't bode well for her successor as party leader, though, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who some say could become Germany's next chancellor. But these results in these European elections show that actually under her leadership, the party isn't doing fantastically. So it does make it less likely, rather more likely, that she might step into the shoes as chancellor after Angela Merkel does eventually go.
Damien, can I ask you about something that's sort of a more domestic political interest here in the UK, and that's in the light of Theresa May's announcement at the end of last week that she was going, and the debate already underway in the Conservative Party, all the talk about potentially a no-deal Brexit. Has that made any impact in the media and in political circles in Germany?
Yeah, I think the Brexit debate is being watched closely in Berlin, particularly by German business, particularly by every political actor. To be frank, I think German voters have completely switched off because it's impossible for many German voters to follow. I think they just view it as chaos in Britain. So I don't think it's something that's discussed in the general population that much, to be frank. But certainly political leaders, business leaders look at the prospect of no deal with horror. So they would do almost anything to make that not happen, to avoid a no-deal Brexit. They call it a chaotic Brexit here in Germany. But the thing they wouldn't do is undermine EU solidarity. So I think what we are seeing as well is any sense of chaos or any sense of problems with the Brexit process is still being fairly squarely put towards Britain, really. So I think the general opinion here in Germany that it's a British problem, it's a Westminster problem, it's an internal Tory problem even, as a lot of what people would say here, and that actually Germany now more than ever should stick to the general EU line, which is really not watering down the EU, not undermining EU solidarity. So I think it's probably what we have seen as well in these EU elections. The other thing that's important to note in the Brexit debate is that given that Angela Merkel's party is now weaker than ever, given the weakness and the instability within the German government, that makes it even less likely that Germany would countenance reopening any sort of deal for the Brexit negotiations with a future Tory leader, because I think Germany is going to be so focused on domestic problems, and when the EU debate comes up in Germany, it's more about sticking to the line of Brussels. So there's less room for negotiation and there's less room for compromise than ever, really, when it comes to Brexit.
Damien McGuinness in Berlin. For now, thanks very much. Well, let's talk about Scotland now. And the SNP has comfortably topped the poll in the European Parliament elections there. The party won almost 38% of the vote, increasing its number of MEPs from 2 to 3. The Brexit Party secured second place with 15% of the vote, winning 1 seat. Liberal Democrats gained 14% of the vote. The Conservatives got 12. Labour came fifth with less than 10% of the vote, down from 26% just 5 years ago. Well, Scotland correspondent James Shaw is in Glasgow now. James, obviously good news for the SNP. Interesting that the Brexit Party took a seat. UKIP, of course, had a seat in the past. There's always been a kind of a pro-exit element in Scottish politics. But what do you make of Labour's performance as a party that was not so very long ago regarded as such an important player in Scottish politics?
Well, it is a really shocking result for Labour to see their support fall off a cliff. That drop in percentage share is presumably something that they weren't expecting. Of course, they knew it was going to be a difficult night, but for it to be such a bad night, I think will come as a bit of a shock to the Labour Party here in Scotland. They lost both their MEPs, including David Martin, who I think is the longest serving UK MEP, and last night he was clearly devastated by that result, as many people in the Labour Party will be. Just a couple of minutes ago, purely by chance, I bumped into Richard Leonard, who is the leader of Scottish Labour, and just casually I asked him how things were going, and his response to me was very short and brusque. How do you think? And you can understand that gives a sense of how difficult a morning, how difficult a day and an aftermath this is for Scottish Labour.
Yeah, I remember David Martin 20 years ago or plus actually giving a lunch for Theresa Gorman, and they had a final fight on camera for us about the future of the European Union. And he'd been, as you say, there very long standing. A lot of Labour figures now being very critical of the party's position, attacking Richard Leonard for having backed Jeremy Corbyn on this question of being a bit ambiguous about the referendum. Has that been a kind of an argument that's been suppressed during this campaign?
Well, I mean, I suppose in retrospect you can see it's pretty obvious, can't you, when you have a part of the United Kingdom, a nation like Scotland, which is so clearly, so sharply defined by being a Remain part of the UK. 62% of the electorate voted Remain back in 2016, and the parties who did really well here, as perhaps in other parts of the UK, are the ones who had very defined positions. The SNP went into this election spelling out that they were the party against Brexit. If you wanted to make a statement against Brexit, you voted SNP, and that message really seems to have cut through. Likewise with the Brexit party itself, but to a lesser extent, because that is a minority interest here in Scotland. So there has to be a question as to whether maybe it might have worked in other parts of the country, but would that idea of being neither one thing nor the other, a soft Brexit, was that ever going to work for voters in Scotland? And things have been difficult for Scottish Labour, goodness knows, since the independence referendum in 2014, when their support started to drop very badly. This is another blow to a party which used to be the establishment party in this part of the world, but now those days do seem like quite a long time ago.
James Shaw in Glasgow, thank you. And that's the view in Scotland. To Wales now, where the Brexit Party won the largest share of the vote too. Nigel Farage's party won almost a third of the vote, 32%, giving the party 2 MEPs. Plaid came in second place with 20% of the vote. Labour in third with 15%. The Liberal Democrats closely behind on 14%. The Tories lost their 1 seat in Wales and dropped to 5th place, just ahead of the Greens, UKIP and Change UK. Let's talk now to our Wales political editor, Felicity Evans in Cardiff. Felicity, good afternoon. The issue won once again for Labour, and already suggestions that Mark Drakeford is shifting his position on this, or at least under some pressure in the Welsh Labour Party to do so.
Yes, that's right. An historically bad result for Labour last night. This has been a machine that has dominated Wales-wide elections for 100 years. So coming third, a major blow not only to the party but to their new leader, Mark Drakeford. And we have had an apparent repositioning from him this morning, as you suggest, in a statement that says, among other things, faced with the damage of a hardline Tory Brexit, Welsh Labour believes that the final decision must be made by the public in a referendum. Now, when pressed on whether that constitutes an unequivocal commitment to a referendum, one party source said it absolutely does, no ifs, no buts. Though the statement itself obviously could be a little clearer on that. It's worth mentioning there are celebrations today for another new party leader, Adam Price of Plaid Cymru. They came second, an historically good result for them. The question will be whether they can build on that momentum going forward into the next set of Assembly elections. And on the question of where Wales stands now after these sets of results, well, pretty divided seems to be the answer. If you tally up the Leave votes and the Remain votes, there's a small margin in favour of Remain, but it is very small. And given that the turnout here was so low, only 37%, it's difficult to extrapolate from that really any strong feeling about where Wales is, especially when you consider that in the 2016 referendum, when Wales voted to leave the EU, turnout was more than 70%.
Forgive me, that's wonderful. Felicity Evans in Cardiff, thanks very much. Right, to the Yorkshire and Humber region now, and the Brexit Party took 3 of the 6 seats. Labour won 1 seat, lost another, with the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party getting a seat each. It means both UKIP and the Conservative Party lost 2 MEPs each in the region. Well, the Brexit Party MEP, one of those victors, John Longworth, is with me. John, good afternoon. Hello. And congratulations, first of all. What do you put your party's success down to?
Well, I think it's very clear that people are angry and frustrated that we haven't left the European Union, that the Parliament and the government haven't actually fulfilled the will of the people, despite the fact that we had a very strong result in the referendum, and that the 2 major parties which gained 80% of the vote in the election had it in their manifestos that they would actually respect that result.
Isn't the difficulty, though, with this result, was Sir John Curtis was saying a little earlier when he came in to talk to me about the breakdown of the results, that in the end all it tells us is that the UK is as polarised, if not more polarised, than it was at the time of the Brexit debate. This is not an out-and-out victory for those wanting Brexit, nor is it an out-and-out victory of those who are opposed to Brexit. And isn't the problem for politicians like you that somehow you've got to kind of rebuild some consensus here if we're leaving, what we're going to be like after we've left, and also not make people feel disaffected by the fact they voted the other way?
I think people are disaffected by the fact that democracy is broken down and we aren't fulfilling the democratic will of the people. You know, when we have general elections in the UK, we don't elect a party and then say, oh, well, we didn't like the result because they only got 40% of the votes. Actually, that wasn't my party, so let's have another election next week. And this idea of amalgamating parties' votes into what is, you know, in that case, do we put Everton and Liverpool's scores in the Premier together?
That's not really an analogy.
Well, it is absolutely an analogy, because this is not a referendum. We had a referendum in which there was a majority of 1.4 million people. 2/3 of UK constituencies voted to leave. 3/4 of England and Wales constituencies voted to leave. Had it been a general election, it would have been a landslide for leave. This is the EU parliamentary
election. That's the problem. You've got a parliament.
It's exactly the point
that has not actually elected on the same terms. It was elected a year after that referendum.
And it was elected on a mandate of the two major parties putting in their manifestos that would lead the EU, the customs union, and the single market. And how many times have you got to tell the establishment in this country? We've told them again last night.
What role do you play? Because presumably, at least in July, you'll go out to Brussels, you'll take your seat as an MEP, you'll sit in the European Parliament, but on the measure of what you're saying, you will be keen for us to be out by the 31st of October.
Well, I was rather hoping...
It's a gigantic waste of time for you and for everybody else.
I was rather hoping that we'd never have to get to this stage, that we would have left already. But of course, while we're in, it's very important that we have people who have the true interests of the UK at heart actually calling out the EU, because they may do nasty things to us. They may also...
Such as? Do you want to tell me what those
nasty
nasty
things might be? Well, there's all sorts of things that they may do in law that could provide real problems for the UK.
But that'd be academic, wouldn't it? They'd never get it through before the time we've left if we're leaving on 31st of October.
It depends on whether we leave on the 31st of October, and that's the key point.
Now, Nigel Farage was saying a little earlier that he thinks it's incumbent on any new Conservative Prime Minister to include you in any, not you specifically necessarily, or maybe, your party in any negotiations with the European Parliament about the future trading relationship.
Well, I think we have a mandate to be involved. The fact of the matter is that the candidates that were chosen for the Brexit Party are all people who've done things in life. They're not professional politicians. We actually have a contribution to make. I personally have done business on every continent. You know, I've been involved in trade most of my career, and I've actually been involved with Brussels and the EU. So we can make a contribution to these things. We certainly couldn't do any worse than the current negotiators, could we?
John Longworth, MEP for Yorkshire and the Humber region. Congratulations. Thanks very much for coming in to talk to us on BBC News this afternoon. Now let's go back to Westminster and Carrie Gracie.
Thanks, Sean. And of course, in London, Labour lost half of their MEPs. They had 4, they now have 2. With me here is one of them, Labour MEP for London, Seb Dance. Congratulations, Seb Dance. Was it a nail-biter?
A little bit of a nail-biter, yes. I won't pretend otherwise.
Did you feel angry with your party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, for not climbing off the constructive ambiguity fence?
Yeah, I'm pretty angry with our stance, certainly. I think that, you know, many of us were warning right from the very beginning what would happen if we didn't have a clear position backing a public vote and backing the option to remain, and saying that we would campaign thank you, and backing Remain in that campaign. I'm pleased now to see that many of the front bench, many members of the front bench, are now saying that's the position we should have had in these elections.
And yet, Jeremy Corbyn's talking about a general election still. Do you think a general election is the right idea, given the very damaged performance that we saw last night?
If we have a clear position, then yes. I don't think it's unarguable that the Tory party has lost the faith of the country. I mean, what an incredibly terrible result.
But you don't have a clear position is the problem.
Well, no, I don't think we do at the moment, and that's been shown in these European elections, but I think it's very, very simple and very straightforward to fix. I had many conversations on the doorstep with people who have been lifelong Labour voters who would say to me, well, you know, if you came out for a clear position one way or the other, I could work with something, you know, I could back you. And I said, well, actually Jeremy has said that we would have a public vote on any option, which is, he said on the Andrew Marr show, I think about 2 weeks ago. And it transformed the response on the doorstep, but it was just too late.
And so if there is a second referendum, obviously what that will do is some Labour MPs are going to suffer in the next general election, aren't they? Because some of them do represent Leave seats.
Well, I think the majority of Labour voters, even in Leave seats, voted Remain. But in a general election, most people don't have Brexit as their number one issue. They have a whole range of issues. But the problem about Brexit is if you are not clear about your position on, let's face it, the most fundamental issue facing our country, it's hard to win the trust of voters on everything else. And I think that's the problem we will face.
So you're saying it. There's another lot of very senior people in the party who are saying this today, but still there's no clear move from Jeremy Corbyn. Do you think he's going to get pushed before conference? Do you think he's going to put it back to conference, put it back to the members, say, you must decide?
I hope so, because we are a member-led party. We have a broad range of people who have come into the party from very many different traditions within the Labour movement. But our membership should be where the direction of policy is set. I hope it doesn't take, cajoling and some kind of nonsense about proxy contests within the party. None of that I don't think any of us are interested in. We just want to get this right, and we want rid of this awful government. And I think we have to have that clear policy, and members, I think, will set that clearly at conference. But it should happen before then.
Seb Dance, thanks for joining us. And that's it from Westminster for now. Let's take a look at the weather. Here's Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Carrie. Very good afternoon to you. It is a bank holiday Monday, so shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the weather is pretty mixed. There is some sunshine to be had, but there are also some showers, certainly grey skies earlier on for this weather watcher in Edinburgh. As we go through the afternoon, those scattered showers, some heavy, some thundery, will continue. The heaviest ones likely to drift out of Northern Ireland into Wales, parts of northwest England, the Midlands. The showers continue through the night as well, particularly across eastern England. We'll keep some outbreaks of rain across the eastern side of Scotland. The winds fall light across Scotland. Here it will be a relatively chilly night, 2 to 6 degrees, not as cold further south where it stays fairly breezy. We go into tomorrow, we will still see some scattered showers, most especially across central and eastern parts of the UK. Further west, not as many showers, more dry weather, some spells of sunshine, but despite that sunshine, tomorrow will be quite a cool feeling day, especially across some northern areas, just 11 degrees there in Aberdeen, maybe 17 in London, not nearly as warm as it has been. But as we head through the week and towards the weekend, southern areas will turn very warm indeed, could get to the middle 20s Celsius. Always the chance for some rain across northern and western parts of the UK. More weather to come later on. That's all from me for now.
You're watching a BBC News special. We'll have much more reaction and analysis on the European election results in the UK and around the European Union. First, though, let's get all the day's sport. Here's Jane Dougal.
Hi there.
Jane, thank you very much. Jane Dougal there at the BBC Sports Centre. Now, welcome back. We're talking about, of course, the European Parliament elections. They took place in the UK on Thursday, and much of the rest of the European Union on Sunday, which is why results are coming overnight. They're still counting in Northern Ireland, the one region of the UK that has yet to declare. Our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy is at that count in Magherafelt. Emma, obviously a lot of the debate about Brexit was about the Northern Ireland and Irish Republic border. How much was that figuring in the debate in the elections in Northern Ireland, and what impact on the result?
It was very much figuring in the debate leading up to these elections. Usually politics is defined in Northern Ireland by unionist and nationalist divide, but this time, of course, people were looking at parties as to whether they are the parties of Brexit or whether they are supporting Remain here. And we have just had, in the last hour or so, the results of people's first preference votes here. Sinn Féin's Martina Anderson topping the poll, closely followed by Diane Dodds for the Democratic Unionist Party. But the real success story of the day is the Alliance Party, a party which neither designates itself as unionist nor nationalist. It is a Remain supporting party, and they have doubled their share of the votes from 2014, from the last European elections, doubled their first preference votes here. A big success story for that emerging centre ground party, because for so long politics in Northern Ireland has been dominated by the unionist and nationalist divide. Brexit has sort of thrown a lot of that up in the air, but it is also a sign of people all changing here. Voters' habits changing, no longer wanting necessarily to be defined by that unionist, nationalist voting pattern, and emergence perhaps of the more centre ground. So a big result for Alliance here, but important to say at this stage, still none of those 3 seats for Northern Ireland are yet confirmed. But with those 3 candidates so far out in front, it will take perhaps another few rounds of counting to look at people's second preference, third preference votes here and so on, because that's the voting system that's used in Northern Ireland. But Sinn Féin, DUP and then Alliance taking that 3rd seat, they all look very strongly on track to take that. So we're expecting results slightly earlier than was expected before, perhaps sometime early evening that will be confirmed. But those 3 candidates now so far out in front, very unlikely that anyone else will catch them. And it was that 3rd seat that was really going to be the interesting contest throughout the lead up to these elections, because the way that voting patterns are in Northern Ireland, there's very little swing between Unionists and Nationalists. It was almost guaranteed really that the biggest Unionist nationalist parties would take 2 of the 3 seats, but there was always that question mark over who would really clinch that 3rd one. So huge celebrations here for the Alliance Party today, and I'm sure there'll be more big cheers when those seats are finally confirmed later on this evening.
So Emma, consolation then for Naomi Long, who of course was at Westminster for one period as an MP and then lost her seat there, so she could be going to Europe. But can you just, for the rest of the UK, explain, I hate to do this to you, but give us a simple explanation as possible of how the voting system works, because it is different in Northern Ireland, isn't it, from the rest of the UK?
It is different, and the reason for that is the unique politics of Northern Ireland because of this big green and orange divide means that you need a voting system that guarantees representation for both sides of the community. Unionist parties defined by their belief in the union of the UK, and nationalist parties generally defined because their belief in a united Ireland, a belief in Northern Ireland breaking away from the UK, if you like, being the ultimate ideology of those 2 sides, which at one point, rewind 30 years, let's just remind the audience, well, bombs and bullets were the result of that kind of divide. Of course, Northern Ireland is a peaceful place now, but because of that unique history of politics, you need this different voting system, the single transferable vote system. It means that voters will mark the candidates in order of preference, and then you have these rounds of voting. You eliminate the candidates with the least votes, and their second preferences then get distributed, and you keep on going. It's a bit more complicated, it's a bit more technical, takes a bit more time, but it gives you that slightly different distribution, which ensures representation for both sides of the community. So that's why things are the way they are here. The other reason that Northern Ireland is a little bit playing catch up in terms of declaring its results, well, they don't count votes on a Sunday here, observing that Christian tradition of the Sunday being the day of rest. So Northern Ireland only started counting at 8 o'clock this morning. But it looks like it is those 3 parties that are going to be taking those seats, and it's a bit of a formality now to count through the rest of those preferences, distribute them all, as I've just explained, add those all up before you get those seats finally confirmed later on.
Emma Vardy, thank you very much for that. It's one of the clearest explanations I've ever heard of the Northern Ireland voting system for the European Parliament. I understood that. Thank you. Now from the academic to the view of the hacks. Carrie Gracie has a couple of them with them down at Westminster.
I'm going to test you on the single transferable vote shortly, just to check that you were listening to Emma properly. But first, though, let's tackle some strategic questions for the big parties, because with me now, Sonia Soda from The Observer and Stephanie Bolton, UK correspondent for German newspaper Die Welt. Thank you both for coming up onto this balcony. Sonia, you first. We've heard from some of the Tory contenders for leadership. Boris Johnson crushing rebuke, he called the vote last night. Jeremy Hunt saying it's an existential question now. What do you think they're going to be considering as they make their pitches?
Well, I think for both main parties, it was a very defeating night. I think for the Conservatives, they're going to be really worried about the rise of the Brexit Party. We've already seen some of the leadership contenders tack right in recent weeks, so talking up the prospect of no deal. Even somebody who voted Remain, like Jeremy Hunt, has been talking about, maybe we could go for no deal. So I think that in the Conservative Party leadership contest, we're going to see the party tap right. I think Labour equally faces huge strategic issues. I think Labour was hoping to come second very much to the Brexit Party. Instead, it was pushed into 3rd place by the Lib Dems by quite a significant margin, actually. I think what that really shows is that Labour's strategy of prevaricating, trying to be all things to all voters, saying to some voters we're a party of soft Brexit, trying to appear like they back a referendum to other voters, just isn't working. working. Actually, voters on all sides seem to kind of reject Labour, I suppose, in quite significant numbers. So for both big parties, there are big strategic challenges, I think, ahead.
Stephanie, your take on this?
Well, it is, in a way you could say nothing has changed. So if you, obviously I see this more from a European, German, Brussels perspective, and people on the continent will look at this, politicians, governments will see that basically the countries are split as it was before. You have on the one hand the Brexit party, then you have actually, if you put all the votes for the pro-Remain parties together, it's even a higher number than the Brexit party. So they will look at this and think, what is the outcome of this? So I heard someone saying to me this morning in Brussels, abwarten und Tee trinken, which means just let's wait and have a cup of tea.
Although, do they really have time to drink their tea? Because this is all coming down the road quite fast in October. Yeah. They're going to be put on the spot over whether they're prepared to reopen the negotiation or otherwise see a no-deal Brexit. As Sonia's explained, you know, the next leader of the Conservative Party, the next Prime Minister, may well have to take that position.
Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, they're also looking at the House of Commons, and they have seen twice the vote that was in contra of leaving the European Union without a deal. So they will be thinking, well, if this really comes to that situation that they have to vote about this, they might reject it. And what happens next? So that Prime Minister might then say, well, either a general election or a second referendum. And the European Union or the Commission has said all the way along that if that is the case, they will extend Article 50.
So while they're drinking tea in Europe, Sonia, back to this question of whether Parliament can overturn a headlong drive towards a no deal. Do you think there are enough Tory soft Brexiteers to actually make the enormous kind of existential decision to vote against their own government?
Well, I think the challenge for Parliament going forward is that they're running out of parliamentary devices to stop a no deal. So we had the Institute for Government, which are experts on this, produce a paper last week that said really there's one fail-safe route to block a no deal, and it's quite a nuclear option. It's a vote of no confidence in the government. So I think there are already a number of Tory rebels who've made themselves known. So people like Dominic Grieve, for example, perhaps even Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, saying they would do something quite serious if they had to stop a no-deal Brexit. So I think there is a chance that we could see Parliament, if it looked really certain that a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, was gunning out to take the country out on the 31st of October with catastrophically crashing out without a deal, there is a chance that some Tory rebels could come together with Labour to vote no confidence in the government. But that still creates a huge amount of uncertainty about what's next, and I think that's why Labour's position in this is so important. Huge pressure on Jeremy Corbyn today to stop his prevaricating and come firmly around to the position of a referendum.
Sonia, I'm just going to interrupt you there because we're just hearing that Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, has just announced his own candidacy for leadership of the Conservative Party and next Prime Minister, as you can see his tweet there. And Sonia, just pick up with that. He's entering what is already quite a crowded field.
Absolutely, and I think the next few weeks, I mean, there's such a sort of a paradox here, really, isn't there? Which is the country is facing this huge question. Time is ticking down to October the 31st, and we've got the Tory party sort of engulfed in a beauty leadership parade. Huge numbers of candidates. It's not actually that clear what the differences are between them. You've got lots of candidates taking very similar stances around things, for example, like, being more gung-ho about a no deal. So I think it's going to be quite a damaging few weeks for the country. All focus is going to be on these sort of Tory leadership candidates trying to out-compete each other and trying to be more like Nigel Farage than the next one, whereas actually the real work around how we're going to get out of this Brexit impasse just isn't going to get done.
And Stephanie, just very, very quickly on the Europeans, once they finish drinking tea, watching all these machinations in London and around the UK, there are going to be decisions for them. How do you see the outcome of the EU elections on the continent affecting the willingness to negotiate of certain parties? I think I'm thinking about the departure of Merkel. I'm thinking about the relative poor performance for Emmanuel Macron's party.
Yeah, you're right. But on the other hand, what I can't see is that they would suddenly now turn around and say, okay, actually we have said we're not going to open the withdrawal agreement and suddenly going to do this, because they have now actually won against the populists this election, and they wouldn't now suddenly turn around and prove the opposite.
Stephanie and Sonia, thank you very much for joining me up here. We'll talk to you again later. And Let's turn now to one of the new Brexit Party MEPs, because former Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe won a place. She's been speaking to our correspondent Sarah Ransom. Let's listen in.
Well, of course, if you look at the map today, it's a sea of Brexit blue. And that is because we just asked the nation a very simple question. We didn't have a great raft of policies. We had one, which was to get Britain out of the EU without a deal. And the nation voted for us. And voted for us big time. So my reflections are that was the second referendum. Twice now the nation have said to Parliament we want to leave. I just hope this time Parliament listens, because if it doesn't, and if we don't get out of the EU on the 31st of October, then we will contest, the Brexit Party, will contest a general election.
I wanted to ask you about that, because Nigel Farage has talked about the ambition of the Brexit Party this morning. He's talked about possibly contesting in the general election whenever that might be. When you think about that longer term, what are your thoughts?
Well, I very much hope that it isn't necessary, because the only way it won't be necessary is if we've left. And we've left cleanly, and there's no doubt about it, and there's no reopening of the argument, and we've gone. And if that happens, then the job of the Brexit Party is done. But if that doesn't happen, if we don't leave, and actually at the moment that's the most likely outcome given their record, if we don't leave, or we leave in name only and stand there one leg in and one leg out, or if there's then a serious attempt to reverse the leave, then we will stand in a general election, yes.
Anne Widdecombe, well, the Green Party have had their best performance in a European election in 30 years. They've won 7 seats. With me is the party's co-leader, Sian Burry. Sian, thanks for coming up here. So your response to this outcome, we just heard from Anne Widdecombe. They're obviously thrilled with their outcome. They said we can't stand 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
We are very, very delighted to get the number of votes that we did, and to more than double the number of MEPs from 3 to 7. We've got people elected in regions right across the UK. They're going to be, if we can stay in the EU, fantastic representatives for their regions. And it's a really strong message people are sending, that they want to remain in the EU, that they support the parties who are calling for a people's vote. We, if you combine our votes with the Liberal Democrats, with Plaid Cymru, with the SNP, the parties who are clearly for remaining in the EU, we have thrashed the Brexit Party today. So Nigel Farage cannot be very happy.
Although
with
the
his
arithmetic
result.
of that is complex, isn't it? Because of course both the main parties, Conservatives and Labour, you know, they are on manifestos of leaving. So if you add them to the leave total,
these are the people in favour of hard Brexit, though. This is, I mean, if you add those two up,
so you're only
beating
comparing yourself with hard Brexiteers, not soft ones.
And I think people voted for people who voted for the Conservatives and Labour were doing so out of loyalty rather than out of a strong desire to send a message. Those people came to us, or alternatively they went to the Brexit Party, and I think our side shows that there is greater support for staying in the EU now than there was in 2016. Look at the number of young people who voted, particularly for the Greens, and this is a pattern we've seen right across Europe. Young people are saying, look, I want a future for the planet, and I want a future inside Europe to make that possible, but also because I value the freedoms that my generation has, and they want to see those too.
And yet it's not clear that all the young people who support that kind of agenda actually came out to vote.
No, but those who did voted overwhelmingly for Green parties. You can see that in Germany, first-time voters, the majority that the Greens in Germany had amongst those voters is huge. We also came first for under-25s in France. In both those countries, we increased our number of MEPs significantly, as well as here. It's very clear what people...
The difficulty is when you bring the kind of electoral arithmetic back to a kind of general election situation, or indeed a referendum situation. It's quite difficult to see how this would all work out. It's quite difficult to extrapolate from last night's result.
This is why we need a people's vote to sort this out once and for all. We need to put something before the people.
What would that something
kind
be?
of deal. And I think the parties who want to remain need to get together and listen to people about the causes of Brexit, listen to what the problems they want solved are, and put together some kind of potential deal that attempts to do something like that, and then puts that to the people in a people's vote. We can't get to the point where we get to revoke versus crash out with no deal at all. That is an unimaginable situation. It's up to all of us who
Well, you say it's unimaginable. It's not unimaginable to lots of hard Brexiteers who voted for Nigel Farage.
I think leaving without a deal, and no deal crash out Brexit, people have not quite grasped how horrific that would be.
Is that not patronising?
We've seen business leaders on your programme today
Nigel Farage's manifesto, the manifesto of the Brexit Party was clearly exactly that, a clean break Brexit, they called it. It was the overwhelming single-party winner in last night's elections.
I think we need to be looking very closely at what that actually means. This wasn't done during the election campaign, but if it came to getting close to October, we'd have to look at that very carefully and listen to the business leaders and listen to people like us who will point out how appalling this would be for the most vulnerable in society. It wouldn't solve the problems that led a lot of people to vote for Brexit, and it would be a disaster for the environment as well as our security. There are a whole list of things for which a no-deal Brexit would be a disaster. We have to be avoiding that. We have to be all working together as
It's a long list that we don't have time to pick apart right now, but there will be other opportunities. Sian Berry, thanks so much for joining us today. And that's it from me for now. Let's take a look at the weather, and we're joined by Ben.
Carrie, thank you very much. Very good afternoon to you. It is pretty mixed out there this bank holiday Monday. I suppose that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. There are some blue skies, some sunshine to enjoy. This is how it looked earlier for a weather watcher in Guernsey. Beautiful scene there. But the clouds were gathering across North Wales. We have seen quite a few showers already. This is the earlier satellite and radar picture. There have been some particularly heavy showers through today so far across Northern Ireland. The odd flash of lightning, the odd rumble of thunder here. This cluster of really heavy showers is likely to push its way a little further southeastwards into parts of northwest England, Wales, eventually down into the Midlands before the day is done. A few showers elsewhere as well. Quite breezy, particularly down towards the south. Maybe scraping up to 20 degrees across the southeast corner, but generally not as warm as it has been so far this bank holiday weekend. Now we go through this evening and tonight. Some of the showers will continue. They become increasingly confined to eastern parts of the UK. We'll also see some more general rain for a time across the southeast of Scotland. Skies clearing elsewhere, where the winds fall light across Scotland. It'll be a relatively chilly night, 2 to 6 degrees. Not as cold further south, because here it will stay quite breezy. Then we get on into tomorrow. We'll continue to see some scattered showers, but these most likely across central and eastern areas. The odd heavy and possibly thundery one across the southeast of England. Elsewhere, we'll see some sunny spells developing, but those temperatures not doing particularly well, particularly in the north. 11 degrees there in Aberdeen, but even further south, 17 degrees in London. Tuesday night will be quite a chilly night under this ridge of high pressure, but as we move into Wednesday, we see frontal systems starting to move in from the Atlantic. This is the start of quite a big change, actually, for the second half of the week. We see some outbreaks of rain moving through Northern Ireland, parts of Wales and the southwest, setting in across northern England, southern Scotland. Brighter skies across the far north of Scotland, but with some showers at times. Quite chilly here, but further south, it's going to start to feel increasingly warm and increasingly humid. And as we move out of Wednesday into Thursday, we continue to see frontal systems moving across northern and western parts of the UK, so there will be some rain here. But to the south of these weather fronts, well, we start to draw our air up from the southwest, and that air is going to feel very warm and very humid. So as we approach the weekend in southern parts of the country, those temperatures are likely to get up into the middle 20s Celsius, maybe 25 or 26 degrees, but always with the potential for some more rain at times across the north and the west. So things stay pretty mixed, actually, over the next few days.
You're watching a BBC News EU election special with Carrie Gracie at Westminster and me, Sean Lay. The Brexit Party, a clear winner. The Liberal Democrats take second place, and a very tough night for the Conservatives and Labour. Nigel Farage says he's ready to take on the biggest political parties at Westminster after his Brexit Party took nearly a third of the vote and won 29 seats in the European Parliament.
We have got a mandate now, and we want the government to include us in their negotiating team. We have got to get ready for leaving the European Union on October the 31st. There's an awful lot we can do.
It was also a successful night for the Liberal Democrats, who campaigned to stop Brexit, coming second with around 20% of the vote.
I'm Carrie Gracie at Westminster, where the two main parties have suffered heavy losses. The Conservatives are pushed into fifth place with a historic low of less than 10% of the vote. One minister says it's time to rethink their strategy.
It's a wake-up call to my colleagues in Parliament that we have to deliver on the instruction the British people gave us in 2016 in the Brexit referendum.
And pressure on Jeremy Corbyn to back another referendum after Labour falls to third place overall. He says the party's position remains unchanged.
What this party does is supports an agreement with the European Union to prevent crashing out, supports putting that proposal, when agreed, to a public vote.
We'll bring you all the results from the UK. Northern Ireland may declare later this afternoon, as well as the picture across the whole of the European Union, where turnout is up and traditional parties have, as in the UK, lost out to smaller ones. And a very good afternoon to you. If you've just joined us, welcome to BBC News. In a major blow for the largest political parties at Westminster, the Brexit Party has emerged the clear winner in the poll for the next European Parliament. Formed only just a few weeks ago, the party led by Nigel Farage won 29 seats and received almost 1/3 of the share of the vote. Both Labour and the Conservatives posted some of their worst ever results. The Liberal Democrats took second place in this election on an anti-Brexit platform. Jeremy Corbyn, pressed now by some senior Labour Party figures to back another referendum, said the party's position hadn't changed, but it had a responsibility to listen and to ensure what he called a public vote on any Brexit agreement that Parliament eventually passes. Well, only Northern Ireland is still to declare in the UK. That may happen, we're told, later this afternoon or early evening. Let's take a look at the results in the rest of the UK. Well, the Brexit Party gained by far the largest share of the vote. It has 32%. Liberal Democrats, they took 20%. That's up 13 points on their frankly dismal performance in the last European Parliament elections. They were held 5 years ago in 2014. This time, Labour came third with 14%. That's down 11 points on those previous elections. The Green Party, although it's in fourth place, increased its support significantly. It took 12% of the vote, its best performance since the late 1980s. The Conservatives fell to an historic low. They polled just 9% of the vote, putting them in fifth place. In Scotland, the SNP dominated the poll with a big lead over the other parties. Well, the UK Independence Party, which won the elections just 5 years ago, and of course is the former party of Nigel Farage, saw its vote fall heavily. It took just 3%. The new Change UK Party also failed to make an impact. It too took 3%. Well, in all, 73 seats in the European Parliament were up for grabs for the UK representation in Brussels and Strasbourg. Brexit Party now have 29 seats. Liberal Democrats have 16. They gained just 1 in 2014, so a big improvement for them. Labour now has 10 MEPs. It's lost 8, including the European Parliament's longest-serving British MEP, David Martin, who'd been representing Scotland since the mid-1980s. The Greens more than doubled their number of seats with 7 MEPs. That's up 4 on 5 years ago. And the impact on the Conservative Party, well, that couldn't be clearer. They now have just 4 MEPs. That's down 15 on those last elections. In Scotland, the SNP took 3 seats. In Wales, Plaid has won a seat in the European Parliament after it beat Labour again into third place. Well, as I was saying, counting in Northern Ireland is still underway. Let's take our first report on the events in the European Parliament elections and what they mean from the UK from our political correspondent Tom Barton. I should warn you, his report does contain some flash photography.
Smiling faces for members of a party that was only launched 6 weeks ago. The Brexit Party, the clear winners of this election, taking almost 1/3 of the vote and 29 MEPs. The party's leader saying that this could be just the start.
If we don't leave on October the 31st, then the scores you've seen for the Brexit Party today will be repeated in a general election, and we are getting ready for it.
It wasn't just a good night for the Brexit Party. Those standing on a clear Remain platform also made great leaps forward. The Greens beat the Conservatives into 4th place, while it was a champagne moment for the Liberal Democrats, coming in 2nd with 20% of the vote.
This is the first time in 100 years that we've beaten both the Conservative and the Labour Party in the same election, and we are clearly able to demonstrate that both the Conservative and Labour Party did badly because they were absolutely split, couldn't articulate what they wanted on Brexit. We've been very clear we are the strongest Remain party.
The one thing that is clear from this result is that voters don't like the tightrope walk Brexit compromises that the two main parties have been offering up to now. What then does that mean for the future? Well, both for Labour and the Conservatives, it means that they're going to be under pressure to adopt simpler, clearer positions. For the Tories, devastation at the polls is likely to see leadership candidates taking even tougher positions.
I'm deeply saddened by the fact that so many candidates and so many activists worked so hard and we didn't get the result that we wanted. And one message is clear from these results. We absolutely need to deliver Brexit. I led the campaign to take Britain out of the European Union, and we must honour that referendum result.
In Scotland, Labour has been wiped out in the face of an SNP surge, while in Wales, the party was forced into 3rd place. The pressure now on the leadership, including from some senior voices, to back another referendum. Jeremy Corbyn today promising to listen.
What you have from me today is a commitment that our party is listening to its members and its supporters and reaching out to other parties across the House of Commons to prevent a crashing out from the European Union with no deal. A commitment that the future will of course be put to a public vote, as we have already proposed in Parliament.
These results providing no easy answers for the parties when they return to Westminster next week. Tom Barton, BBC News, Westminster.
And let's go straight to Westminster now, and Carrie Gracie.
Thank you, Sean. Well, as we've been reporting, a very tough night for both the Conservatives and Labour, and with the Tory leadership race already underway last night, likely to have a big impact on how Theresa May's prospective successor pitches their Brexit solution. But with Labour also losing ground, there are questions as to what its future policy should be. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, has said the results from the EU elections were very disappointing. Mrs May tweeted, "A very disappointing night for Conservatives. Some excellent MEPs have lost their seats, some excellent candidates missed out. But Labour have also suffered big losses. It shows the importance of finding a Brexit deal, and I sincerely hope these results focus minds in Parliament." Well, with me now, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. Focusing minds for sure, but focusing minds in the direction that Mrs May would like to see?
No, I mean, I think she thought that these results would have focused the minds of MPs on all sides to push her deal through. Of course, we've now gone beyond all of that, and it's leadership contenders looking at how they try and appeal to the grassroots of the Tory party, because they need them to vote for them, obviously, but also they now see the enemy as Nigel Farage. So inevitably you'd think they're going to tack more towards, leaving without a deal. We've heard from Boris Johnson today saying those Tories who've deserted the party won't return unless Brexit happens on the 31st of October. Jeremy Hunt is talking about an existential crisis facing the Tory party. It is, yeah. They all think they're going to be potentially destroyed unless they deliver Brexit. So a big focus on Tory leadership contenders. And then there were 9. Another one has joined today. Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, entering the fray to try and make his case as well.
So worst electoral result for the Tories in nearly 200 years, but it's no bed of roses for Labour either, as we've been hearing. And Labour, terrible performance, for example, in Scotland.
I mean, it's incredible to be 5th in Scotland, to be, I think it was 3rd in Wales, 2nd in London. So in their heartlands, they're facing a massive massive problem, and a lot of their own MPs think it's because they weren't clear about their position on Brexit. Emily Thornberry last night saying, you know, when she went to the doorstep to explain the policy to people, it took at least 5 minutes, and she said that just wasn't a way that you could carry on. Now, the main problem is about the second referendum. Are they in favour of one or not? In what circumstances or not? This is what John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, had to say today.
So we're in a situation now, is where do we go from here? And we're faced with the potential of a Brexiteer extremist almost certainly becoming leader of the Tory party, whether it's Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab or some of that ilk. So we're faced with the prospect of a no deal, which could have catastrophic consequences for our economy. A Tory leader being elected on that basis, no matter what the damage to jobs in the economy. So we've got to prevent that. How do we do that? Well, of course, we want a general election, but realistically, after last night, there aren't many Tory MPs that are going to vote for a general election. It'd be like turkeys voting for Christmas. So our best way of doing that, I think, is going back to the people in a referendum, and I think that's what our members want. So we're saying quite clearly, if there can be a deal, great, but it needs to go back to the people. If it's a no deal, we've got to block it. And the one way of doing that is, I think, going back to the people and arguing the case against it, because it could be catastrophic for our economy. It's not just me saying that. It's Philip Hammond, the Chancellor. It's others across the parties now that are saying that, independent economists as well. And I'm not willing to stand by and let my constituents lose their jobs or have their livelihoods undermined by this.
So are you saying then it's a referendum under any circumstances, that's the only way through now?
I think it is, yeah.
So at the end, they're very clear in any circumstances. So you now have a situation where Jeremy Corbyn isn't being quite as clear as that, but you have Tom Watson, his deputy, now his Shadow Chancellor, Emily Thornberry, Keir Starmer, quite a lot of them in the Shadow Cabinet. Welsh Labour have broken ranks as well, saying there must be a referendum, whatever happens. So this is something they are going to have to resolve pretty quickly. Jeremy Corbyn suggesting it can be done at the next conference.
And so if it's done at the next conference, I suppose it allows him to climb off the fence in a dignified fashion, because he can say, well, this is what members want.
It is, but then by that point, we're talking about 2 weeks before we leave without a deal, potentially. So, you know, there is a timing issue here. Now, I'm sure if you're Labour and those who are backing Jeremy Corbyn and all this say, hang on a minute, this is a Conservative Party problem. They have inflicted this on the country. It's up to them to sort it out. But I suppose it's whether you think that actually Parliament has a duty to do so. And I think from some Labour MPs looking at this, they feel that they're being hit, not as badly as the Conservatives, but they have been certainly losing votes to the Liberal Democrats, particularly in the south, and to the Brexit Party in the north. We saw what happened to them in Scotland. You know, this is a huge problem facing those two main Westminster parties.
Vicky, thank you. Now, as we've been hearing, the Brexit Party have top polls in every part of the UK, apart from Scotland, won by the SNP, and in London by the Liberal Democrats. Northern Ireland is still left to declare. Rishi Chakrabarty's been taking a look at all the results.
This has been an election of stark contrast, with the Brexit Party putting in a very impressive performance, but strong performances too from the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and a real disaster for Labour and the Conservatives. Let's take a look at some of the details. Castle Point here in the east of England. This was one of the Brexit Party's strongest results. Look at that, 59% of the vote here in a very Leave voting area, but a really, really strong performance, leaving all the other parties behind there. Brexit Party also coming out on top in Windsor and Maidenhead. That's Theresa May's constituency, her own backyard. They came out on top in St Helens here in the northwest, beating Labour in their own heartland. Look at that. Brexit Party on 35% and the Labour Party on 22%. For the Liberal Democrats, it was also a very good night. Here in Elmbridge, for example, they topped the poll by 39%. Now, this is an area that had been Conservative for the last 3 European elections. And if we take a little look at the change in the share of the vote, look at that. The Conservatives plummeting by 31% to the benefit of the Liberal Democrats. For the Lib Dems, it was a great night in London. They topped the poll in London, and that included Islington, which is Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. That tale of Labour woe was reproduced in Scotland, where the SNP took almost all the areas, all the local authority areas that there are. And in Blaenau Gwent, Labour also suffered there at the hands of the Brexit Party. One word for the Greens, who came top in 3 areas, and that included Bristol as well, and they'll be very happy with their performance at this election. I think the takeaway, though, from these elections is the result for the Conservative Party, who on 9% of the vote share came 5th in the table. And there is one remarkable fact for the governing party, which is that in the whole of the United Kingdom, they failed to top the vote in any single local authority area in this entire election.
Rita Chakrabarti. Well, with me now is the SNP's Drew Hendry. So let's have a look at Scotland. Mr. Hendry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah.
And obviously the SNP did well last night, and you managed to somehow ride that tiger of keeping the Leavers and the Remainers roughly behind you.
Well, I don't think we just did well. It was an historic result last night. Scotland emphatically got behind the SNP to say no to Brexit. Brexit has been comprehensively rejected by the Scottish voting public.
And do you think it was you doing well? I mean, I don't want to kind of rain on your parade or anything, but do you think it was you doing well or Labour doing badly?
Well, I think the SNP went out with a very, very clear message that Scotland's for Europe. And that message chimed with people on the doorsteps and in their homes, and that's why people came out in such great numbers. Our vote is up some 9% on 2014, so that's why people came out in those numbers to get behind the SNP and to say absolutely emphatically no to Brexit, to reject that
and obviously
Brexit
your
situation.
party leader, Nicola Sturgeon, she has been First Minister of Scotland. She's been in Ireland today, and she's been talking rather angrily about the contempt with which Westminster has been treating Scotland over the whole Brexit issue. Is that something you felt did chime on the doorstep?
Well, I've seen it here personally, being an MP in Westminster, the disdain that the Tories and the Labour Party have had for Scotland's needs since Scotland voted overwhelmingly 62% to remain. Since then we've seen the Scottish Government's attempt to compromise over Brexit if it had to go ahead to look after Scotland's interests. We've seen the Scottish Parliament, every party but the Tories, ignored by the UK government in that situation, and the majority of Scotland's MPs ignored too. And on the doorsteps, when I've been speaking to people, folk have noticed that. They've seen that across Scotland, and they're not willing to put up with Scotland being ignored anymore.
And talking of which, Nicola Sturgeon again saying today that she wants to hold another independence referendum and she wants it before the end of next year. Do you think there's any chance of that happening?
Well, I think the mandate was clearly there in the election in 2016. The SNP went into that election saying that if there was a material change in circumstances, we would have a referendum. I think there's every reason now, if we're going to, as it seems, lurch towards a chaotic hard deal Brexit with Tory infighting over their leadership contest for the next 8 or so weeks and taking us right up to the brink, I think there really is the need now to say to the people of Scotland, you have an opportunity to take a different path from this chaotic Brexit dish that's been served up, the different path from the premiership of somebody like Boris Johnson or one of the others, and this is your opportunity to take that.
Except there is no opportunity unless that Prime Minister decides that Scotland can hold a referendum. But leaving that question aside, do you think that Scotland now, which way would it vote?
Well, I think more and more as people have gone through this process, they've seen this Brexit farce unfold. They've seen the fact that Westminster doesn't pay attention to Scotland's unique needs, which it has that are very different to other parts of the UK. And I think more and more people, and I think now that polling is starting to show this, more and more people are actually seeing that in future, if we're going to have this Brexit played out in the way it is, that people are willing to get behind independence in the referendum, and I believe that's what will happen.
Although, coming back to what you've called the Brexit farce or car crash and that kind of language, looking at what can be done,
what it is.
Looking at what looking at what can be done, what do you think the way out is now?
Well, I think that the UK government, particularly the Labour Party, need to wake up now and see that the only way to resolve this on a UK basis, and we're very concerned about the impact of Brexit because the UK government's own analysis shows that there's no version of Brexit that doesn't harm our economy, affect jobs and affect people's living standards. So the best way to solve this is to actually put this back to the people in a people's vote. That's what should happen, and that needs to happen very soon. But I am concerned now that with another round of Tory vicious infighting to come over their leadership contest, that Labour Party will do what they've been doing up until now and just fight amongst themselves while all this unfolds.
Drew Hendry? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it from me for now. We'll be back in a short while. Let's take you back to Sean now.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Let's take a look at the overall results across the rest of the European Union and the spread of seats in the new European Parliament, which meets next month for the first time. Well, the big centre-right and centre-left blocs that have traditionally controlled the Parliament since direct elections began in 1979, their combined majority has gone. And that's because of an increase in support for diverse parties, the Liberals, the Greens and Nationalists. Pro-EU parties are still expected to be in a majority, but those big blocs are now going to have to seek new allies. The Liberals and Greens had a good night across Europe. The Nationalists did particularly well in Italy, in France and of course here in the UK. However, the centre-right European People's Party does remain the largest single bloc. Analysts say it's likely to form what's called a grand coalition with the Socialists and Democrats, with support from Liberals and the Greens. It may not actually mean too much change in who's controlling the direction of the European Parliament. Negotiations and horse trading lie ahead though. Meanwhile, turnout was a surprise in this election. The number of people voting across the European Union rose to 51%. That's up from 42.5%, which was the turnout in 2014. That had been part of a long trend of decline in voter numbers, and it's the best result since 1994. Well, our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus, who's in Brussels, now reports.
Across Europe, one of the surprises of these elections, Green parties. This was Germany, where they surged into second place. Germany's result mirrored the picture Europe-wide. The traditional centre, conservative right, social democrat left on the slide, Greens and others profited. So now the Greens are being courted by those old parties looking for their support.
People are talking to us. Obviously, they are keen to have the Greens around the table. And so if we are invited around the negotiating table, we'll go there.
And it's possible the centre-right under pressure might now fragment further.
It's a totally new situation, a totally new setup, and I really believe, I'm convinced that the vote of the European citizens has a clear message that European Union must be reformed in order to be strong again.
For the Greens and all the other parties, how their national results translate into power here in the European Parliament is through the alliances they can forge. And what's clear there is that the surge some predicted for far-right anti-EU forces hasn't materialised. That didn't mean any real celebrations for Emmanuel Macron's party in France. It was beaten just by Marine Le Pen's far-right EU sceptics. But it wasn't a decisive win for her. Her share of seats may actually have fallen. It was Matteo Salvini's far-right League in Italy that was a big winner. However, his allies elsewhere in Europe stumbled, losing seats, limiting his influence. So the most significant gains of all may have gone to the Liberals. Their candidate might now be in with a chance of securing the top EU job on offer, President of the European Commission.
The monopoly of power is broken. And this is, of course, why we can do something else.
Overall, then, the EU's centre under pressure has held firm, but change may still be coming.
Let me bring you some breaking news from elsewhere in the European Union. This is Austria. In fact, you may remember this is the scene in the Austrian Parliament in Vienna, which doesn't look very dramatic now, but it has just passed a vote of no confidence in the government of Sebastian Kurz. He leads a centre-right government. Remember, it was in coalition with the far-right Freedom Party, which has had a couple of goes in government over the last 20 years or so. Sorry, we've lost those pictures from the Vienna Parliament. Not much happening now. All the action was a short while ago. The key point, though, is that because that caretaker government that came after the Freedom Party pulled out of the coalition, because their leader resigned because he was caught up in allegations of corruption, what he called a sting that was filmed on camera. He denied any corrupt activity. He resigned. The party pulled out of coalition. The Parliament has now voted no confidence in the temporary government. Mr Kurz is like to have to give way to somebody else to form a temporary government to get us through to elections in Austria probably now in September. So that's just happened in the last few minutes. All happening in the European Union. Nothing to do with the European Parliament elections. Back to those elections now, though, and to Paris, where we can speak to our correspondent Hugh Schofield. I mean, Hugh Schofield, the big story there is actually the success of the far right and of Marine Le Pen.
Yes, and the success, nonetheless, also of Emmanuel Macron. I mean, I know he lost, but he's a government in power for the last 2 years. Normally, they get thrashed at elections like this, and he very nearly won. And I think that requires a bit of reflection too. For me, what's happening in France may be something which is what's happening across the rest of the Union. Slowly, written its first sort of format here. It's a kind of new political world struggling to be born. And what we see here is the old bipolarism, left-right, completely knocked for six, inexistent now. The socialists got 6%. They were ruling the country a few years ago. I mean, 2 years ago. The Les Républicains, the centre-right, Sarkozy's party, de Gaulle's party, they got 8%. Between them, they didn't even muster 14, 15%. And instead, you have two new parties, Le République En Marche of Macron and the Rassemblement National, National Rally of Marine Le Pen, who are the new dominant players. And we have a ding-dong, between them. They're both very, very tight. Neither can really say they won. They were one edged ahead of the other, but it's neck and neck. And they completely dominate the political landscape. And that is a new order of things. What's happened at this election shows that it wasn't a flash in the pan from 2 years ago, that the situation has persisted. The République En Marche party has got new MEPs. The Rassemblement National has maintained itself as the main opposition party. And what looks like happening is that they are going to, govern this country or, dominate the politics of this country for the time being. And in a way, this is a reflection which is perhaps more accurate of the old left-right divide of the way people split up in our world today.
Hugh, what then is the difference between the Marine Le Pen and Macron approaches to the European Union?
Well, I mean, it's chalk and cheese, if that's an appropriate metaphor. I mean, they exist because they're the opposite of each other. And what we saw in the election campaign here was the way they both were actually secretly quite pleased that they had the other as the main enemy, because it meant that they could rally around all those who might otherwise have gone to other parties by saying, we're the party that can keep out X, whether that was Le Pen or Macron. Marine Le Pen clearly attracted a lot of votes for people who would have been on the far left, because she was the one who was most likely to embody a victory over Macron, and she did. And Macron, on the other hand, with his fervent European credentials, was able to say to the country, look, I'm the only one to push back on this challenge from populist nationalism that's here in France and elsewhere. And they both got the vote they looked for. Very, very geographically, very, very different. I mean, Macron clearly based in the big cities, Le Pen vote in the periphery and in the small towns around the country. It's a new reality, and I think what France has maybe over other countries, at least the political situation reflects that now.
Hugh Schofield in Paris, as ever. Thanks very much. Now time for a look at the weather. Here's Ben Rich.
Sean, thank you very much. A very good afternoon to you. Yes, things are pretty mixed this bank holiday Monday. No great surprises there. For some, we've had sunny skies. For others, there have been quite a few showers, and certainly the sky's looking quite threatening for this weather watcher in East Dunbartonshire. You can see the showers quite widely spread across the chart through this afternoon. Some particularly heavy ones drifting out of Northern Ireland into Northern England, Wales and the Midlands. Some of the showers continue through the night as well. Some outbreaks of rain for a time across the eastern side of Scotland. Winds easing across Scotland. So here it will turn a little chilly, 2 to 6 degrees, not as cold further south where it stays fairly breezy. So we go on into tomorrow. There will still be some showers around, the odd heavy one, possibly the odd thundery one across the southeast of England. But further west, you'll notice not as many showers, more in the way of dry weather and some spells of sunshine. Will be quite a cool day, though. The winds coming down from the northwest, those temperatures struggling, 10 degrees in Newcastle, 17 in London. But as we head through the outlook towards next weekend, in the south, there's some real warmth to be had. Further north and west, there will be some rain at times.
Hello again, you're watching BBC News. We'll have much more reaction and analysis of the European Parliament election results here in the UK and across the European Union. First though, let's get an update on the day's sporting action. Here's Gavin Ramjan. Afternoon, Gavin.
Yes, afternoon, Sean. We're underway now. We'll have more for you later, Sean.
Gavin, thank you very much. Gavin Ramchun there at the BBC Sports Centre. Right, before we return to other election matters, let's take a look at some of the day's other main stories. A man and woman have appeared in court charged with the murder of 2 teenagers who died in a house in Sheffield on Friday morning. The woman, who is the mother of the dead children, is also accused of the attempted murder of 2 other children. Alison Freeman was in court.
The defendants appeared together in the dock here at Sheffield Magistrates Court this morning, both wearing grey T-shirts. Sarah Barras, who's 34, is accused of 2 counts of murder over the deaths of her 2 teenage children. That's Blake, who was 14, and Tristan, who was 13. Both at a house in Sheffield on Friday morning. Now, she's also accused of 3 charges of attempted murder relating to 2 other children. Brendan Machin, who's 37, was accused of 2 counts of murder also. No pleas were given today, and the pair were remanded in custody to appear at Sheffield Crown Court tomorrow morning.
Alison Freeman there. The car makers Fiat, Chrysler and Renault are in discussion to merge their 2 businesses. The combined company, that would be split 50-50 between the shareholders of the 2 existing companies, will create the 3rd largest car maker behind Volkswagen and Toyota. Car makers have faced pressure to consolidate amid major shifts in the industry, including the move towards electric vehicles. Now, what's believed to be the clearest ever moving footage of Queen Victoria has been discovered in the film archive of a museum in New York. The importance of the piece of film went unrealised for decades, until a curator from the British Film Institute was shown it earlier this year. With this exclusive report, our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell.
Queen Victoria in sharper focus than ever seen before. This was her last trip to Ireland in 1900 and is believed to be the last time she was filmed before her death less than a year later.
It's the best view you will ever get of Queen Victoria in moving pictures.
The footage had been stored for decades in New York's Museum of Modern Art, but it was only when Brian E. Dixon, a curator with the British Film Institute, was shown it that its historical significance was truly realised.
I nearly fell off my chair because I'd never seen Queen Victoria in close-up before. It's completely unique because you can see the Queen's face for the first time, probably since 1900, since this was shown. It's close-up. You can see expressions, you can see her in movement rather than just as a stiff portrait or a still photograph.
Queen Victoria embraced the new medium of film. She and Tsar Nicholas II were filmed at Balmoral in 1896, and the following year, 40 cameras were used to capture the Queen's Diamond Jubilee.
Very much film was an extension of a whole series of image making about Queen Victoria.
It makes her seem real.
It makes her seem real, and she is real.
But what sets this film apart is the level of detail, and that's largely down to the film's size. 68mm on the left, and on the right the footage was filmed in 35mm, a cheaper format which became the industry standard despite the loss of detail. The result? Very few films of such high quality were made, and no others capture so clearly this living, breathing, moving monarch. Sarah Campbell, BBC News.
And is it just me, or does it look like Queen Victoria was wearing tinted spectacles, or maybe even sunglasses? Back to the European elections now, the serious stuff. Carrie is at Westminster.
Yeah, I think that was just you, Sean, actually. So now, back to the serious stuff. And with me, Sonia Soda from The Observer, Stephanie Bolton, UK correspondent for Die Welt. Thank you both for coming up on the balcony again. Sonia, you first. Just watching those pictures of Queen Victoria, it reminded me that this is actually, what we've just seen, the worst Tory election result since the early 19th century, since before those pictures of Victoria.
Which says it all, doesn't it? You really do have to go back a long way. But yes, I think both main parties took an absolute drubbing, as predicted, as forecast by lots of pollsters in the election results last night. And I think both main parties face big questions about their strategy going forward as a result. So the Conservatives will look at, the huge number of voters that left them for the Brexit Party and think, gosh, maybe we need to start being a bit more Nigel Farage. On the other side, you've got Labour, who lost some voters to the Brexit Party, but I think more voters to strongly Remain parties like the Lib Dems and the Greens. I mean, for the Lib Dems, it was an absolutely extraordinary result, leapfrogging Labour by a good few percentage. So for Labour, we're going to see see lots of pressure on Jeremy Corbyn from senior shadow cabinet ministers. It's already started this morning. They're saying to him, your prevarication strategy of trying to be a soft Brexit party to leave voters but a referendum party to remain voters just isn't working. You're going to have to pick going forwards.
Stephanie, put it in a larger framing for us, because one of the interesting things is we always use our domestic UK lens, but actually centrist parties have lost out across the continent in these elections.
Yes, they have, and I think Germany is the best example for that. So the Social Democrats, the SPD in Germany, who's in a coalition with the CDU, Angela Merkel's party, they have had a catastrophic night. They did not only lose in the European election, but they also lost one of their 70, I mean, it's not quite Victorian times, but after Second World War, they were always in power in the city of Bremen. That was really the most social democratic city in Germany. They lost it as well. The CDU has also been hammered pretty much. The CSU, interesting, not so much, because they have the so-called Spitzenkandidat Manfred Weber, who might eventually become president of the European Commission. And they didn't fare so badly, but the CDU and the SPD have really suffered, while, say, not the fringes, but more the Greens and the Greens and the AfD, not so much neither, but the Greens especially, they have really had a perfect day.
And the one thing that's really striking as well about the result across the continent is that there aren't any Brexit successor missions out there. The European electorate is not convinced by the Brexit performance to back an exit in the Netherlands or a Frexit in France, and that kind of messaging has gone away, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has, absolutely. And interestingly, yesterday in Germany, always at 6 o'clock sharp, the results come out, and then they interview all the leaders of the party. And they interviewed also Alexander Gauland, who's the leader of the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the anti-immigrant right-wing party. And he literally said, Brexit is one of the reasons why we didn't do so well in these elections.
And Sonia, coming back to the UK experience then, do you think that the political parties here are just running around thinking about their own domestic experience, or do you think they're looking at that European agenda and thinking, well, actually, there are a lot of parties now getting MEPs into place who are saying we have to change this from the inside rather than leave? Do you think that kind of encourages the Remainers to think there's more room for change in the EU itself?
I suspect that that is probably the case. You've had a lot of talk about what politicians term a Remain and Reform agenda in recent weeks, and I think a lot of people feel like that there are things that need to change about the EU if we're going to stay in it, but actually we'd like to stay in it and try and change it from the inside. So I think that will offer some hope. But if I'm being totally honest, Carrie, I think we have become very inwardly focused in our politics in Britain in the last kind of 3 years. And so I think very much that both the parties and voters, when we went to the polls last Thursday, really had Britain in mind, the British domestic political situation and Brexit and how that shapes our relationship with the EU. So I think it has been very inwardly focused.
And just coming to the very difficult dilemmas facing senior politicians, then we saw Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, enter the race this afternoon. We've heard Jeremy Hunt talking about an existential crisis for the Tory party if we don't deliver Brexit. Boris Johnson's talked about a crushing rebuke. I mean, they have very difficult choices today, don't they?
They do, and I think what we're seeing is, you know, they're looking at the sort of meteoric success of Nigel Farage's Brexit party, although, you know, he did have a big support base to build on from his old roots in UKIP, but he has been very successful. They're looking at that and thinking, you know, gosh, we need to tap right. So we're seeing even people like Jeremy Hunt, who voted Remain in the 2016 referendum, has hinted at a no deal in the run-up to this Tory leadership race, which we all know was going to happen. So I think we are going to see the Tory party tap to the right, and that puts us in a really difficult position as a country, because I think it's very, very conceivable that in a few weeks we have a Prime Minister, you know, essentially elected by just 120,000 Conservative members, not by the public at large, who is much more gung-ho about a no-deal prospect than we know Theresa May was. Even though she said she was no deal's better than a bad deal, we know that she was quite reticent about that behind the scenes, and that raises very big questions about a potential parliamentary showdown coming up to October. What will Parliament do to block no deal? How far will they go if we had a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, saying we've not made any headway with the EU and we're going to take Britain out without a deal?
Big questions coming up, Sonia Soda. Stephanie Bosson, thank you both. And that is it from me for now. We'll be back in a short while. Sean, it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Well, our reality check correspondent, Chris Morris, of course, has been a Europe correspondent as well in his time, is with me. Chris, the question that's raised by all of this is, the Brexit Party has enjoyed this big success. Didn't have a manifesto. To be fair, not the only party that didn't issue a manifesto in these elections. But nonetheless, people aren't clear beyond saying we're angry and unhappy about the government's failure to deliver Brexit, what it wants to do. Is there any clarity?
Not a huge amount, because, as you say, no manifesto, very little detail on the party website, beyond the obvious thing: we want to leave the European Union. Now, the big thing that Nigel Farage has been talking about in the election campaign, we're going to hear a press conference from him in the next half hour, but his big message in this election is that he wants to leave with what he calls a clean break Brexit. It's interesting, he's tended to avoid the term no deal Brexit. Maybe clean break sounds a bit more uplifting.
A bit more positive sounding.
But it still means that there would be a fairly sudden rupture, and all the rules and regulations that have governed our relationship with the European Union over more than 40 years would in effect disappear overnight. Now, the Brexit Party and Mr Farage has said, yeah, but we can, within that, still do some deals. But one of the other things they've said they would definitely do, they produced a pledge card during the election which had one or two details on it. One of them was this: the £39 billion divorce bill, which is in the withdrawal agreement, which the government has agreed to pay to the EU over a number of years to settle past debts and future obligations. Mr Farage says we're not going to pay any of that. So that's hardly going to create sort of warm relations with the European Union at this rather critical moment. But, you know, when it comes down to it, the big thing that he's said throughout is, and it's a term we're going to hear a lot of, we want to leave the European Union on World Trade Organization terms.
Now, that question of the WTO is interesting, isn't it? Because there are some people, and really prominent Brexiter conservatives who were saying this back in 2016, saying it's absolutely fine. It'll be a painless move if we go on WTO terms. Everybody has to operate by the same set of rules anyway. It's not kind of the Wild West. Others saying, no, WTO rules have kind of stings in the tail because they're supposed to be almost like a fallback if all else fails.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to hear a lot about this in the Conservative leadership campaign as well as from the Brexit Party, so get used to this. What does it actually mean? Not a lot, actually, because the rules of the World Trade Organization are, if you like, the basic building blocks of international trade. And they only offer pretty rudimentary benefits on their own. You need to build on top of it. Now, what the Brexit Party says is, don't worry, we can use this thing called Article 24, which means we'll still be able to trade with the EU without any tariffs or taxes on goods crossing borders. The problem with that is that Article 24 is something that you need to reach agreement with another party about. So the UK can't impose it on the EU or vice versa.
But presumably you can argue that because, you know, their companies and their businesses and their consumers benefit from trade with us, it's actually in as much in their interest as in ours that we do get an agreement and we do get this sort of, it's in the interest of both parties to get a deal on those terms.
There's no question that if you ended free trade abruptly, there was no frictionless trade, both sides would suffer. And Mr Farage's message has been, if push comes to shove, the EU will come running to us for a trade deal. It's not what the European Union is saying. And interestingly, if there were to be no deal, that's not an end state. You then have to think, well, what do we start talking about then? Mr Farage says, we'll talk about free trade, but take a look at what the EU has said. It has said very clearly, ministers from all 27 countries meeting agreed this. Its first priorities in the event of a no-deal Brexit to talk about, it's rather familiar, isn't it? The divorce bill, the Irish border and citizens' rights. Exactly the things
I have a sense of déjà vu.
That are at the heart of the withdrawal agreement negotiated by Theresa May's team, which has been rejected 3 times by the House of Commons. So some simple slogans from the Brexit Party, which have proved attractive and clearly generated a lot of support. But Brexit is a very complex process.
I said at the start of the introduction that you, of course, are a former Brussels correspondent, Chris. You spent many, many, many years out there. You've sat through a lot of Brussels meetings, a lot of those all through the night summits. Is it possible that these elections, and I don't mean just in the UK, but across the rest of the European Union, could give some of the EU leaders pause for thought? Because as we heard from Hugh Schofield in Paris not that long ago, it's not just in Britain that parties sceptical about the current direction of the European Union have done very well.
They have, and that will give them some pause for thought, but it's not that unexpected. It's, if you like, the continuation of a process that was already there. Roughly 20% of the seats in the previous parliament were occupied by parties you could generally say were kind of from the radical right, Eurosceptic in different forms. But don't forget also the other story of the elections, both here and in other European countries, is that parties right in the centre have done well. The Liberal Democrats, President Macron's party in France. The Greens will be a much bigger bloc in the European Parliament than ever before. So the story, as it is here, really, is one of, the, if you like, the fragmentation. The old big blocs on the centre-left and centre-right, both, we've seen that here, but we've seen it across Europe, will no longer be calling the shots. But it's not necessarily a protest vote in one particular direction.
Paradox, though, is that we could be leaving the European Union just at the point at which more of the European Union, or more of the voters in the European Union, and therefore the politicians in the European Union, are starting to move in a less federalist direction.
Yeah, I think there's a strong argument to say the EU is moving in the direction that the British would always have favoured, focusing on things like sort of the single market and getting economic relations in a really good shape. Less about political integration. Of course, there are federalists there, and there always will be. But I think you're right. If you like, there's a bloc in the EU that was very much moving in Britain's direction. And if the UK leaves, they will miss us when we're gone.
Chris Morris, our reality check correspondent, as ever. Thanks very much. Now, when you want to unpack election results in any election, there is really only one man to turn to, Sir John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde. He came into the studio a little earlier at the end of his long marathon stint in covering these elections to give me his view, and up some, if you like, of the elections in the UK, minus, of course, Northern Ireland, which still has to declare.
Well, there were two contests going on Thursday. One was between the Conservatives and Brexit, and it was essentially a battle amongst Leave voters. And the question was, to what extent would Leave voters, frustrated and disappointed at the government's failure to deliver Brexit, would end up being attracted by Nigel Farage's Brexit Party? Well, the answer was rather a lot. It's pretty clear that well over half of Conservative voters switched towards Nigel Farage's party, which, with the 32% or so of the vote, it got pretty much what the opinion polls expected, and the Conservatives at 9%, if anything, were doing slightly worse. So very clear that voters on the Leave side of the argument strongly punishing the government, not least because many of them actually think that leaving without a deal would be preferable than the apparent endless extension that we're involved in at the moment.
So in a sense, they accepted Nigel Farage's argument that he pushed with the Brexit Party.
Yeah. On the other side of the other battle that was going on was more on the Remain side of the debate, and it was between Labour and both the Liberal Democrats and the Greens for the Remain vote. Now, here the polls were very uncertain, and most of them had said actually Labour Party should still come second. But all of them were detecting that during the course of the campaign, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens seemed to be pulling away more and more Remain voters from the Labour Party. And the question was the much clearer, definitely, we want a second referendum, and by the way, we are hoping that this will come up with a different result stance of the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and Change UK would attract voters away from the Labour Party. Well, it now looks as though it did, not to the same extent that the Brexit Party has drawn away votes from the Conservatives, but because this was, in a sense, a much less anticipated result, it's perhaps come as rather more of a shock to the Labour Party, and perhaps surprise to Liberal Democrats in particular, than is true on the other side of the debate. But it does therefore mean that on the one hand, the Conservative Party is now going to have this debate: should the next Tory Prime Minister be embracing the idea of leaving without a deal? But equally, should the Labour Party now move much more clearly to saying that it's in favour of a public vote on whatever Brexit deal emerges, in order to shore up a Remain vote, which has always been the largest share of this vote, but which now seems at risk of being lost?
The Conservative leadership contender Boris Johnson was writing this morning that these results were clear, and what had to happen was that the government had to deliver on Brexit. Are they really that clear?
Well, no. I mean, it's true that around 35% of people voted for parties that were saying they would have no deal, and those undoubtedly represent a majority of Leave voters. But 35% is rather less than 50%. It's difficult to argue that this demonstrates that a majority of public are in favour. And in fact, the 33% is roughly what we know from opinion polls as the kind of proportion that's in favour of no deal. But equally, on the other side of the fence, I mean, some want to add the numbers up to say that actually 40%, rather more people voted for pro-referendum parties than for no-deal parties. Therefore, this was a mandate for a second referendum. Well, we can argue about the extent to which the SNP's vote is actually a Remain vote. It is predominantly, but not wholly. And if you take them out, actually it's 35-35. But in any event, whether it's 35 or 40, it's still less than 50%. So I think the honest truth is that neither side can claim on the basis of these results that voters have sent a clear signal. It should be one thing or the other. The signal the voters have sent on both sides of the argument is that many of them are now sufficiently polarised as to which choice they prefer, that the two, as it were, extreme options of leaving without a deal and having a second referendum, as the polls are suggesting, two most popular options, and options that about which voters feel sufficiently strongly that many a person who might otherwise be expected to vote Conservative or Labour switch to one of the smaller parties.
How worried should the Conservative Party be by this result?
Well, I mean, point one to make is that we know from the opinion polls that not as many people would vote for the Brexit Party as it did in Thursday as would in general election. But we also know from the opinion polls that maybe 15, 16, 17, 18% currently would. Now, maybe that number will come down a bit as the European elections fade, except that, of course, Brexit's not going off the agenda anytime soon. And this may be a European election which gets remembered by voters rather more. And the truth is, I don't think the Conservative Party can afford the Brexit Party running at 15, 16, 17, 18%, because certainly all the opinion polls at the moment for Westminster voting intentions have the Conservative Party behind the Labour Party with no prospect of being able to form another administration. So to that extent, at least, yes, the Conservative Party do have to worry. And I think in particular, it's unlikely that that Brexit vote is going to disappear unless and until the Conservatives deliver Brexit. A second promissory note which says, you know, we're better able placed to deliver this than Nigel Farage is probably not going to work, and that therefore the next Tory Prime Minister is probably going to have to try to work out a way of delivering Brexit within the arithmetic of the current House of Commons, because the option of going to the country way was unlikely to look very attractive.
Sir John Curtis there. Right, let's take a break from the politics and have a look at what we normally talk about on bank holidays, the weather. Ben Rich is at the Map. Afternoon, Ben.
Hi there, Sean. Thank you. Good afternoon to you. And I think it is a bit of a talking point still this bank holiday Monday, because it's mixed out there. It's one of those days where one moment you have blue skies overhead, just like this. This was the scene in Guernsey a little earlier on. And then the next minute, a big cloud like this comes along and gives you a drenching. Yes, it is a sunshine and showers day. This is the radar picture from earlier on. You can see some really heavy showers that have moved across Northern Ireland. There has been the odd flash of lightning here. Those heavy showers now making progress across the Irish Sea into northwest England, parts of southern Scotland. They'll get down into Wales and the Midlands. Quite a keen breeze as well, particularly across the southern half of the UK. Not quite as windy further north. And those temperatures were not as high as they have been, particularly down towards the south, 18, 19 degrees. And further north, just 10 or 11 degrees for Stornoway and for Aberdeen. And then we go through this evening and tonight. We continue to see some showers drifting through. Still the odd heavy one here and there. Some clear spells as well. The winds will ease across Scotland. So here, actually a relatively chilly night, 2 to 6 degrees. Any showers that remain here could even be wintry over high ground. Not as cold further south, because here it will be a little bit on the breezy side. So we go into tomorrow, and to all intents and purposes, it is another sunshine and showers day, but there are some subtle changes. Many of the showers, I think, for central and eastern areas, whereas further west, there shouldn't be as many. There'll be more in the way of dry weather and some spells of sunshine. Certainly a drier day for Northern Ireland, but with the winds coming down from the northwest, it's never going to be desperately warm. Temperatures topping out between 11 and 18 degrees. And as this ridge of high pressure slides through during Tuesday night, well, it could be quite a chilly start to Wednesday morning, a touch of frost in places. Then we see frontal systems approaching from the west. So after what will be a bright start for many on Wednesday, we'll see increasing amounts of cloud and some outbreaks of rain swinging across Northern Ireland, parts of Wales, the southwest, into northern England and southern Scotland. A few showers across northern Scotland as well. Those temperatures generally 12 to 18 degrees, but it'll start to feel a little bit humid down towards the south, and that is the start of a change that takes us towards the end of the week. Frontal system still wriggling around across northern and western parts of the UK, but the further south you are, to the south of those weather fronts, well, we start to bring the air wafting its way up from the southwest. That'll be mild air, quite warm air, in fact, quite humid air as well. So have a look at what that does to the temperatures. Down towards the south by next weekend, middle 20 Celsius, but the further north and west you are, slightly different. There will continue to be some rain at times.
It's 4 o'clock. You're watching a BBC News European Union election special with Carrie Gracie at Westminster and me, Sean Lay. The Brexit Party a clear winner. The Liberal Democrats take second place, and a very tough set of results for both the Conservative Party and Labour. Nigel Farage says he's ready to take on the biggest parties at Westminster after his Brexit party took nearly a third of the vote and gained 29 MEPs.
We have got a mandate now, and we want the government to include us in their negotiating team. We have got to get ready for leaving the European Union on October the 31st. There's an awful lot we can do.
That's a surge in support for the Liberal Democrats, who campaigned to stop Brexit. They came second with around 20% of the vote.
I'm Carrie Gracie at Westminster, where the two main parties have suffered heavy losses. The Conservatives are pushed into fifth place with a historic low of less than 10% of the vote. Home Secretary Sajid Javid becomes the latest MP to join the race to become the next leader of the Conservative Party. And pressure on Jeremy Corbyn to back another referendum after Labour falls to third place overall. He says the party's position remains unchanged.
What this party does is supports an agreement with the European Union to prevent crashing out, supports putting that proposal, when agreed, to a public vote.
We're going to bring you all the results here in the UK. We're going to have the latest political reaction we're expecting here in the next half hour from Nigel Farage and from Sir Vince Cable. And we'll be exploring what happened in Europe, where turnout was up and the traditional parties, as here in the UK, lost out to smaller ones. Hello, very good afternoon to you, and if you've just joined us, welcome to this BBC News European Union election special. In a major blow for the largest UK parties at Westminster, it's the Brexit Party which emerged as the clear winner in the poll for the next European Parliament. It was formed only a few weeks ago, but the party, led by Nigel Farage, has won 29 seats. It received almost a third of the share of the vote. Mr Farage himself is on his way back to Brussels and Strasbourg in his 20th year as an MEP. Both Labour and the Tories, though, posted what were among their worst ever election results. The Liberal Democrats took second place on an anti-Brexit platform. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has been pressed by some senior Labour figures to now back another referendum. He said, though, that the party's position hadn't changed, but it had a responsibility to listen and to ensure what he called a public vote on any Brexit agreement. Only Northern Ireland is still to declare its results, but let's take a look at the rest of the elections in the UK. Well, the Brexit Party, as you can see, gained the largest share of the vote with 32%. The Liberal Democrats took second place with 20%. That's up 13 points on the position last time these elections were contested in 2014. Labour came third with 14%. That's down 11 on the elections then. Meanwhile, the Greens, they increased their support. So although they're in fourth place, they on 12% of the vote, and that was their best performance in about 30 years. The Conservatives, though, fell to an historic low. They had just 9% of the vote overall. That puts them in fifth place. The SNP dominated the poll in Scotland with a big lead over the other parties, and further indications from Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP's leader, that she's going to push for an independence vote, perhaps in the second half of next year. Now, UKIP, which of course was Nigel Farage's party 5 years ago and was under his leadership the big winner in those elections, saw its vote fall heavily to just 3%, as did the new Change UK party, also failed to make any impact, taking in its first election UK-wide just 3% too. Well, in all, there were 73 seats up in the European Parliament for UK MEPs. The Brexit Party now has 29 seats. The Liberal Democrats have 16, and they gained just one in 2014, so a big improvement in their performance. Labour has 10 MEPs. It's lost 8 of them, including the UK's longest-serving MEP up in Scotland. The Greens more than doubled their number of seats, 7, that's up 4 on last time. The impact, though, on the Conservatives couldn't be clearer. It had easily the worst performance of the night by losing 15 of its MEPs. It's down now to just 4. In Scotland, the SNP won 3. In Wales, Plaid has won a seat after beating Labour. Labour again in Wales is in 3rd place. Well, counting is continuing in Northern Ireland. We hope we might get the result later in the afternoon, probably early this evening. Our first report on the political events overnight and today is from our political correspondent Tom Barton, and a warning that his report does contain some flash photography.
Smiling faces for members of a party that was only launched 6 weeks ago. The Brexit Party, the clear winners of this election, taking almost a third of the vote and 29 MEPs.
Yeah, Brexit.
The party's leader saying that this could be just the start.
If we don't leave on October the 31st, then the scores you've seen for the Brexit Party today will be repeated in a general election, and we are getting ready for it.
It wasn't just a good night for the Brexit Party. Those standing on a clear Remain platform also made great leaps forward. The Greens beat the Conservatives into 4th place, while it was a champagne moment for the Liberal Democrats, coming in 2nd with 20% of the vote.
This is the first time in 100 years that we've beaten both the Conservative and the Labour Party in the same election, and we are clearly able to demonstrate that both the Conservative and Labour Party did badly because they were absolutely split, couldn't articulate what they wanted on Brexit. We've been very clear we are the strongest Remain party.
The one thing that is clear from this result is that voters don't like the tightrope walk Brexit compromises that the two main parties have been offering up to now. What then does that mean for the future? Well, both for Labour and the Conservatives. It means that they're going to be under pressure to adopt simpler, clearer positions. Theresa May today sharing her disappointment, saying the result shows the importance of finding a Brexit deal and hoping it focuses minds in Parliament.
Good morning.
The result is focusing the minds of those hoping to replace her, like the Home Secretary Sajid Javid, who joined the race today. For many of the contenders, though, the message from voters is a simple one.
I'm deeply saddened by the fact that so many candidates and so many activists worked so hard and we didn't get the result that we wanted. And one message is clear from these results. We absolutely need to deliver Brexit. I led the campaign to take Britain out of the European Union, and we must honour that referendum result.
In Scotland, Labour has been wiped out in the face of an SNP surge, while in Wales, the party was forced into 3rd place. The pressure now on the leadership, including from some senior voices, to back another referendum. Jeremy Corbyn today promising to listen.
What you have from me today is a commitment that our party is listening to its members and its supporters and reaching out to other parties across the House of Commons to prevent a crashing out from the European Union with no deal. A commitment that the future will of course be put to a public vote, as we have already proposed in Parliament.
These results providing no easy answers for the parties when they return to Westminster next week. Tom Barton, BBC News, Westminster.
Right, we're going to Lambeth now, not to hear from the Archbishop of Canterbury, but to hear from Sir Vince Cable, who's with party activists there.
As for our party, Liberal Democrats, I think we've done brilliantly well. Taken together with the local government election results a few weeks ago, we're clearly now a major national force again. And our next big task is to work with other people in other parties who are like-minded, initially to stop Britain crashing out of the European Union by accident. There's a task ahead, but we've had a brilliant result and we've got a lot now to build on. Thank you very much.
We're expecting some questions to Sir Vince Cable from the journalists to that. Let's see if we're going to get any.
I'm going to have you do a one-on-one with the BBC first, and then I'll take you over.
In fact, it looks like he's doing separate interviews. So we'll leave Sir Vince Cable. We'll hear what he says in the interviews recording with the BBC at the moment in just a short time. Let me bring you some breaking news, though, that's coming to us. This is very interesting in the light not just of the European Parliament election results, but also because of the Conservative Party leadership contest, and that is that Nicola Sturgeon has given her strongest indication yet. She was speaking at an event in Dublin that she expects to call for another referendum on independence from the UK in the second half of 2020, the second half of next year, despite the fact the UK government is saying that, of course, it's determined there shouldn't be another referendum because the result in 2014 was the rejection. So we'll have more, we hope, from the SNP and Scottish Reaction a little later. Now they're back to Carrie at Westminster.
Thanks, Sean. So here we're going to have a word with our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. And Vicky, let's pick up that issue about an independence referendum in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon sounding determined today, but what is the likelihood?
I mean, she said before that she thinks there should be one before the next Scottish elections, but this is sort of pinning it down a little bit more. And she has been under a lot of pressure from some within her own party to move to this position where she is more specific about a second independence referendum. Now, I think from her point of view, she, of course, wants to make sure that it could be won this time round and will be looking very carefully at the polls. But I think she probably views the prospect of a new Conservative leader, one who may well move to a no-deal Brexit. She might see that as a good chance because she would look, of course, at the result in Scotland at the last referendum where Scotland voted overwhelmingly, around 60-61% to remain, even though it was worth pointing out 1 million people in Scotland did vote to leave the EU. But she would point to that, I think, and think that that might be the thing that would prompt Scotland to go for independence a second time round. But of course it means the Westminster Parliament has to allow it first. So the government here would have to give its permission.
And yet another potential nightmare for the new Conservative leader, new Prime Minister, the dissolution of the Union as a referendum issue. But turning to that question, the next leader of the Conservative Party, we have another candidate hat in the ring.
Yeah, that's right. We're up to 9 candidates now. The Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, has thrown his hat into the ring, joining many others. And it's hard to see really how any of them can get beyond the issue of Brexit and what they do about it, because it is unresolved, because it has brought down the former lead, well, still the leader, but the Prime Minister Theresa May. You know, they need to come up with a plan for how they're going to deal with it. And of course, they will be under tremendous pressure to take a hard line because they are under pressure from Nigel Farage and his Brexit party. We've had Boris Johnson today saying that actually those Conservative voters who have gone over to Nigel Farage's party may never come back if Brexit is delayed again beyond October the 31st. Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, has talked about it as an existential crisis that could, of course, in the end destroy the Conservative Party. So it's going to be intriguing in the coming weeks to see what plans each of them come up with, because they have ultimately to appeal to the grassroots of the Conservative Party. And they, of course, as we know, are much more pro-Brexit than the rest of the voting population and also have less of a problem with a no-deal Brexit.
Vicky, thank you. Now, we heard the Liberal leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable, a moment ago, out and about in Lambeth, celebrating his party's success. He joins us now down the line. Sir Vince Cable, thank you for talking to us. Were you surprised by the scale of your victories in the elections overnight?
Yes, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, it was fairly clear we had momentum and we were doing well, but I'm delighted by the scale of the popular vote and of the seats we've won. And I think a bigger picture is that if you take the Remain parties as a whole, we've had a very strong turnout, a very good result. And I think we're now demonstrating that there's a majority of people in the country who don't want to leave the European Union now.
Well, the psephologists are not exactly drawing that conclusion, though, are they? What the conclusion we have from Sir John Curtis on these points, who's doing the psephology on the BBC, is that, yes, there's obviously a polarising Remain vote, which is visible in your result, and there's a polarising Leave vote. You said you were pleasantly surprised by your own result. Are you unpleasantly surprised by the Brexit Party's result?
Well, not greatly. I mean, they've made a small advance on where the UKIP party were when the last European results were announced. But I think, there clearly is going to be arguments backward and forward, and the only way now to resolve the issue is to go back to the public and have a referendum on whether we leave or stay, and on what are the terms of leaving. I mean, it's the only way of resolving what is, as you rightly say, a very polarised electorate.
Well, that seems obvious to you, but it still doesn't seem obvious to the Labour leader, despite the quite vocally expressed views of his front bench. He's still talking about preferring a general election.
Well, that is another option, and that may well happen if we get a new Conservative leader who wants to establish some credibility. And whether they would risk election, I'm not sure, but it certainly is an option. But I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's position is now very weak. I mean, he's been almost humiliated in these elections. It was understandable the Tories were going to take a hammering, but for the Labour Party to go down so far and become so discredited with this ambivalent position towards Brexit, I suspect his own position is a good deal weaker than it was a few days ago.
If we can just talk about your electoral fortunes again for a moment, because obviously it was a good result, as everyone's saying, for you overnight. But many are also saying it's a protest vote over Brexit. It would not be repeated in a general election. It would be a wasted vote there.
Well, it clearly isn't a wasted vote, because otherwise we wouldn't have done so well in the local elections either, where far from being a protest vote, it was often a very positive vote for Liberal Democrats in local government. Now, clearly when we get to a general election, we have the familiar problem of first past the post, but I think in a way British politics is now changing in quite a radical way. I would be surprised if the Conservative Party or the Labour Party survive intact to the general election. There are tremendous tensions now within the two traditional parties, and we may get a completely different kind of political alignment by the time we next go to the polls nationally. And Liberal Democrats will be in a very, very strong position to lead opinion in those elections.
Is that you with evidence or facts to support that, or is that you just stirring it up to provoke a more imminent existential crisis for the two main parties?
Well, I don't need to. I mean, you just listen to the way they talk to each other. And the Conservative Party are clearly in terrible disarray. We don't know what's going to happen with their leadership election. The Labour Party has been quiet for a while, but we know that there is a latent civil war that could break forward again at any time. No, I don't think I'm exaggerating. I mean, the tensions, the cracks in the system are all too apparent.
Talking about tensions and cracks in the system around the questions of leadership, of course, your own party will soon have a leadership battle as you depart. Is that going to be all sweetness and light?
No, I think it's very good. We're doing this in a very orderly way, as I hoped. I said we would have a planned succession. That's what we're going to get, but there is now a competition between potentially very good candidates. I wish them well. I will remain active myself in the broader movement. No, I'm very optimistic about where this is going to lead my party.
And so who are you supporting for that role? Do you have a preferred candidate?
No, I don't. It would be inappropriate for me to pick sides, but in any event, the candidates I know about are very, very capable. They've served in governments in senior roles. They're very good opposition campaigning politicians as well. So I think the party will be in good hands, whoever it is.
And what will be your first word of advice to them? What will be your first instruction about what they should do on their first week in office?
No, I'm not giving instructions. I will be, talking privately about some of the problems any party in our position faces, trying to build up to the next step. But no, they'll be taking on the leadership in a very good position, but there's a lot more to do. We've still got to win the battle over Brexit. I'm optimistic now, but it's got to be won.
Sir Vince Cable, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And with us now, Conservative MP James Morris, joining us on the balcony. Thanks very much. Now, I know you're Vice Chair of the party, and that means you don't express preferences either in terms of...
That's right.
But what do you think of the challenges are for them today?
Well, look, this was a very bad set of results for the Conservative Party. I don't think there's any way of spinning it otherwise. We failed to deliver Brexit by the 29th of March, so as the government, we have to take some responsibility for that. Prime Minister, in her resignation speech, also took responsibility for it. So now the party needs to move forward, and the party has challenges. We need to deliver Brexit by the 31st of October, and whoever is the next leader of the Conservative Party needs to bring the party together and bring the country together.
So, you know, we heard Sir Vince Cable saying there, and we've heard it indeed from senior figures in your own party, in fact from as senior as the Chancellor, Sir Philip Hammond, real concerns about the possibility of tacking towards a no-deal Brexit.
Well, that's going to be a question for those who are putting themselves forward for the leadership contest. I would prefer us to leave the European Union with a deal. I supported the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, but we do need to deliver Brexit. But that is going to be a matter for the leadership contenders.
Okay, so if I can just press you on the choices that may be coming down the road for somebody like you, if it comes to October the 31st, it's coming close, and the question is no deal Brexit or no Brexit, which way will you go?
Well, look, it's on public record. In the indicative votes in Parliament, I voted to keep no deal on the table. I thought it was a mistake to take no deal off the table. I think Parliament was wrong to take no deal off the table. So I think it's imperative for the Conservative Party to deliver Brexit. That's why we had such a bad set of results. People were frustrated by the fact that despite our efforts, we weren't able to leave by the 29th of March. So that is an absolute imperative for whoever is the leader of the Conservative Party.
So a no-deal Brexit is better than no Brexit in your list, hierarchy of...
I would prefer... I know
what you prefer.
I would prefer a deal.
Yeah.
But we need to leave the European Union in order to fulfil the promise of the referendum in 2016.
And yet, coming back to the point I make about Philip Hammond, that is clearly not the view of every MP in your party, is it? So are you in danger of a situation where you get some soft Brexiteers or Remainers who vote down the government?
Well, look, you're asking me a hypothetical question about what may happen in a future scenario.
Time is short.
But there's a leadership contest about to happen. I don't know who's going to be in that leadership contest, but it's for them to lay out how they will approach this issue on the basis that it's imperative that we need to leave the EU by the end of October. But you're asking me about a hypothetical which I can't comment on right now.
And when you look then, let's look at something that you can comment on. When you look to Europe and see the results there, do you get a sense that there might be a partner out there who's prepared to go back, unpick the negotiation, put it together in a more congenial fashion, that you can all go into the eye lobby for it?
Well, as I say, I think it would be better for us to leave the EU with a deal. Now, it's in our interest...
So I'm asking for your assessment of Europe.
But it's in our interest, and it's in the interest of the European Union to have that deal. We've had elections across Europe, they've been mixed. We've had, obviously, populist parties doing quite well in some areas, not doing so well in other areas. The European Commission is going to be different when we get to September. I think that there is a strong possibility that the EU will want to do a deal with the UK so that we leave in an orderly fashion. They don't want a no-deal Brexit, but as I say, I'm on public record of saying I think we should keep no deal on the table.
James Morris, thank you so much for joining us. Now, as you've been hearing, the Brexit Party have top polls in every part of the UK, apart from Scotland, which was won by the SNP, and London by the Liberal Democrats. Northern Ireland still left to declare. Rita Chakrabarti has been crunching all the numbers, looking at all the results.
This has been an election of stark contrast, with the Brexit Party putting in a very impressive performance, but strong performances too from the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and a real disaster for Labour and the Conservatives. Let's take a look at some of the details. Castle Point here in the east of England. This was one of the Brexit Party's strongest results. Look at that, 59% of the vote here in a very Leave voting area, but a really, really strong performance, leaving all the other parties behind there. Brexit Party also coming out on top in Windsor and Maidenhead. That's Theresa May's constituency, her own backyard. They came out on top in St Helens here in the northwest, beating Labour in their own heartland. Look at that. Brexit Party on 35% and the Labour Party on 22%. For the Liberal Democrats, it was also a very good night. Here in Elmbridge, for example, they topped the poll by 39%. Now, this is an area that had been Conservative for the last 3 European elections. And if we take a little look at the change in the share of the vote, look at that. The Conservatives plummeting by 31% to the benefit of the Liberal Democrats. For the Lib Dems, it was a great night in London. They topped the poll in London, and that included Islington, which is Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. That tale of Labour woe was reproduced in Scotland, where the SNP took almost all the areas, all the local authority areas that there are, and in Blaenau Gwent, Labour also suffered there at the hands of the Brexit Party. One word for the Greens, who came top in 3 areas, and that included Bristol as well, and they'll be very happy with their performance at this election. I think the takeaway, though, from these elections is the result for the Conservative Party, who on 9% of the vote share came 5th in the table. And there is one remarkable fact for the governing party, which is that in the whole of the United Kingdom, they failed to top the vote in any single local authority area in this entire election.
Rita Chakrabarti, and that is it from me for now. We'll be back in a while. In the meantime, here's Sean.
Thank you very much, Carrie. We promised you that we would hear from Nigel Farage at some point. We just heard, obviously, from Sir Vince Cable talking there to Carrie. Nigel Farage has had his news conference, but they did it in a corridor, not in the main room where it had all been set up. We're going to get it replayed and we'll bring it to you in just a few moments' time. Before that, let's take a look at the overall results across the rest of Europe and the spread of seats in the new European Parliament, which will sit for the first time next month. Well, the big centre-right and centre-left blocs, which dominated the last parliament, have lost their combined majority amid an increase in support for Liberals, Greens and Nationalists. Pro-EU parties are still likely to be in the majority, but the traditional blocs will have to seek new allies. The Liberals and Greens had a good night, as did Nationalists, in particular in Italy, France, of course, here in the UK. However, the centre-right European People's Party, that's really sort of the big umbrella party for many of the sort of Christian Democrats parties, like Angela Merkel's party in Germany, they remain the largest bloc, and analysts say it's likely they'll form a grand coalition with the Socialist and Democrats bloc, propped up probably by Liberals and Greens. But that depends on negotiations and horse trading. There's going to be a lot of that in the next month or so. Meanwhile, turnout was a surprise. The number of people voting rose to 51%. That's up from 42.5% when these seats were last contested in 2014. It's bucking, therefore, a long-term trend of decline in voter numbers. It's the single best result since 1994. Right, let's bring you now what Nigel Farage had to say, the leader of the Brexit Party, who's been re-elected once again as an MEP in the southeast of England.
All these people come from the real world. They won't mind not being in the European Parliament. They've got plenty of other things they can do. They can get on with the rest of their lives. They're doing this because they believe in it.
And what's your plan for after this, Westminster?
Well, I tell you what, if we left the Brexit process to the Conservative and Labour parties, we would never, ever have got a Brexit that resembled anything like what we voted for in the referendum. This clearly will put pressure on them, pressure on the Conservative leadership contest. And the question is, are they actually going to respond to this pressure, or will those parties go on being coalitions? Coalitions of Leavers and Remainers, and if they do, and if they stay indecisive, and if we don't leave on the 31st of October, then I think we can produce a result in the next general election that will stun them.
Nigel Farage, and that's the explanation why they didn't do it in the press conference. Apparently there wasn't room for all 29 Brexit Party MEPs to stand together, and he wanted to be photographed there. You notice prominently Anne Widdecombe, former Conservative minister, at his side, new MEP in the southwest of England. Right, let's pause now and take a look at the weather prospects with Darren Baird.
Hello there. It feels a bit cooler for us today. A significant drop in temperature compared with yesterday across the northeast of England, where we've got a northerly breeze. Temperature struggling to 11 or 12 degrees under the cloud. It was 23 across East Anglia yesterday, 17 to 19 today. And those showers are developing more widely. Some of them could be heavy and thundery, and they'll continue to drive their way southwards during this evening before slowly fading away across some western areas later on in the night. Could turn quite chilly in rural parts of Northern Ireland. Typical temperatures overnight, 16 to 8 degrees. Sunshine for Northern Ireland and for many western parts of Scotland, Wales, down the western side of England. Very few showers here. Most of the showers will be further east, particularly across the Midlands, eastern England, and those temperatures as a result of the showers and the northerly breeze really struggling to 10 to 13 degrees in some areas. A bit warmer further south and further west, 17 or 18 degrees. Chilly overnight, mind you, and then after some early sunshine, we're going to find these weather fronts bringing less cold air but more cloud and some rain on Wednesday.
Hello, you're watching BBC News. We're going to have more reaction and analysis of the European Parliament election results shortly. First, though, let's get an update on all the sporting action. Here's Gavin Ramjan.
Thanks very much indeed.
Sarah Campbell, BBC News.
Fascinating stuff, that. And let's go back to Carrie Gracie. And I'll tell you, Carrie, I've taken a quick straw poll of our colleagues here, and we reckon they're definitely spectacles. They look a bit steampunk to me.
They do. I had a look at them there as well, and I saw exactly what you meant. Now then, Sean, getting more serious, one of the new Brexit Party MPs is former Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe. She has been speaking to our correspondent Sarah Ransom. Let's listen in.
Well, of course, if you look at the map today, it's a sea of Brexit blue. And that is because we just asked the nation a very simple question. We didn't have a great raft of policies. We had one, which was to get Britain out of the EU without a deal. And the nation voted for us. And voted for us big time. So my reflections are that was the second referendum. Twice now the nation have said to Parliament we want to leave. I just hope this time Parliament listens, because if it doesn't, and if we don't get out of the EU on the 31st of October, then we will contest, the Brexit Party will contest a general election.
I wanted to ask you about that, because Nigel Farage has talked about the ambition of the Brexit Party this morning. He's talked about possibly contesting in the general election whenever that might be. When you think about that longer term, what are your thoughts?
Well, I very much hope that it isn't necessary, because the only way it won't be necessary is if we've left. And we've left cleanly, and there's no doubt about it, and there's no reopening of the argument, and we've gone. And if that happens, then the job of the Brexit Party is done. But if that doesn't happen, if we don't leave, and actually at the moment that's the most likely outcome given their record, if we don't leave, or we leave in name only and stand there one leg in and one leg out, or if there's then a serious attempt to reverse the leave, then we will stand in a general election, yes.
Anne Widdecombe, their newly successful MEP. With us now, Professor Sarah Hobbarts from the London School of Economics. Sarah, you're an electoral behaviour specialist. Is your assessment similar to that of Anne Widdecombe? I mean, she's basically saying there that was the second referendum that we just saw. The outcome was clear. People want to leave and they want to get on with it.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, of course, it wasn't a referendum. It was an election to the European Parliament. But she's right when she says that Brexit was the issue that most people had on their minds, we think, when they went to the polls. And the way you can see that is in this clear divide between the parties like the Brexit Party that topped the polls, that stood for a clear Brexit message, but also the parties on the other side, the Remain Party, the parties that promoted a people's vote. And if this was a referendum, of course, the Brexit Party didn't get more than 50% of the vote. So I'm not sure it's to her advantage to present it like that. It's always hard in an election that's not a referendum to say which side won. But if we do group together the parties that went out and said we want to remain, we want to have a people's vote, it looks like they did slightly better at around 40% if we look at the Greens, the Liberal Democrats and SNP. So in that sense, the referendum was not clearly won by one side or the other. In fact, what we see is that the public is very much still divided on the issue.
And what is harder to see is how the traditional Tory or Labour supporters, how they fall, because of course their results were very bad, both of the main parties, but they still did get votes, and it's not clear, given the convoluted positions of both of those parties, it's not clear where they would fall.
No, I mean, what we saw is that these two main parties that didn't have as clear of a position on Brexit in the eyes of voters both lost out. It looks like when we look at the local constituency data, what we can see is that they really lost out both in Remain-leaning and in Leave-leaning areas, whereas where the Brexit Party picked up most votes were in the areas where a lot of people back in 2016 had voted for Brexit, and where the Liberal Democrats and the Greens picked up most votes, where the Remain did well back in 2016. So there was that clear new cross-cutting divide in British politics, and the Conservatives and Labour really lose out to both sides.
And of course, some of that was flagged up in advance. People were saying it would turn out like that. The scale of it perhaps deeper, worse than both of those main parties imagined. But what else do you read into the results when you go crunching through those numbers?
Well, we have to be, of course, careful in terms of sort of translating from a European Parliament election with low turnout, and also where voters know they're not voting for a government, they're voting to send a signal. And this is exactly what they did. They sent a signal to the people sitting over here in Westminster about Brexit. But it was not one signal, it was two very different signals. We have one part of the population that sent a strong signal saying, you know, we want to get on with Brexit. And we had another part of the population saying, no, we want a second referendum, or we want to revoke Article 50 or something of that type. So it's really not, we're not any further in terms of being able to use this vote to say, well, now we know what the public wants.
And of course, another key player in the Brexit drama is the EU. We've seen elections across the continent. Is there anything in the results that you've seen there that affects the debate here, do you think?
Well, what we see in Europe, there's some similarities, although of course across Europe these were different elections because they were very much about the composition of the parliament, but you also have domestic dynamics across Europe. And one of the key things to take away from the European results is the fragmentation and the weakening of the two major party groups, the centre-right and the centre-left. They are now weaker in parliament. That means that going forward they will have to work together with other groups such as the Liberals in order to come to agreements. And that's also agreements on a future trade deal with the UK. So in that way, in a sense, it might be a little bit more complicated for the UK to work with the EU in the future, but we're not seeing a major shift so far. What we have to look out for now in terms of the EU is who is going to be the next Commission President. Those talks are going on now in the EU after these European Parliament elections, and that will be interesting to watch.
Sarah, thank you. Now, as we saw a few minutes ago, UKIP leader Nigel Farage, not UKIP leader, Brexit Party leader, has been speaking at an event in Westminster. So let's hear from our political correspondent, Jessica Parker, who was there for us. Jessica, tell us more about what he had to say.
Well, as well as what he had to say is how he said it. Now, I'm in the room where the press conference was actually supposed to happen. And if you look at it now, it's rather empty. And the fact is, it didn't happen in here at all, because Nigel Farage arrived with his many victorious MEPs, including the likes of Anne Widdecombe, including the likes of Annunziata Rees-Mogg. And they stood outside of this room in front of a Brexit Party banner, and at that point Nigel Farage rather spontaneously decided he didn't want to do the press conference in here as had been set out for him. He wanted to do it instead in the other room. So they were a rather jubilant, spontaneous crowd this afternoon, but he repeated some of the similar themes that we've heard from the Brexit Party before. He said that nobody would ever trust the Tories again. He brought up Theresa May's many promises to leave the European Union on the 29th of March, so the Conservative Party had failed to deliver that. Was pretty dismissive of the Conservative leadership race, and he talked as well about how the Brexit Party, in his view, having topped the ballot, now has a mandate to take part in the negotiations going forward. Of course, a big question there is what negotiations. Of course, the European Union has said that whilst the future relationship might be up for debate, the withdrawal agreement, which is the part that many people have a problem with, is not open for renegotiation.
And so, Jessica, in terms of the actual content, you know, hard content of his clean break Brexit that he talks about, did you hear any more of that, any more of the detail?
Well, look, he's reiterating that in his view, in the Brexit Party's view, that they want to have what's known as a WTO Brexit, a World Trade Organization Brexit, so revert to World Trade Organization rules. In other words, a no-deal departure. And he wants some of his MEPs, who he claims are very experienced in business, very experienced in negotiations, to get round the table with the EU in order to make sure that happens. But As I say, it's not exactly clear how he's going to do that. He did suggest that whoever ends up succeeding Theresa May could approach the Brexit party in order to involve them in the negotiations going forward. But as I say, not entirely clear how that's going to work out. The other thing he also talked about is how he now wants to get his Brexit party on an election footing for a general election. They're going to start looking at candidates for all 650 constituencies going forward, so quite an extensive piece of work to do there. I asked him as well about policy. There's been quite a lot of discussion about how the Brexit party has been criticised for being just a single-issue party, so simply wanting to leave the European Union on World Trade Organisation rules. What on earth else do they stand for? He said that he would now be consulting supporters of the party going forward in order to try and work out a wider policy platform, but he mentioned that he wanted to, for example, help the self-employed, and he's voiced concerns before about the House of Lords, so looking at that. But he said that for now what he'd be doing is trying to recruit people to stand in the 650 constituencies across the UK, so they're on an election footing for a potential general election, and go out to their supporter base to see what kind of policies they should have going forward.
No shortage of tasks on the to-do list for the Brexit Party leader. Jessica, thank you very much. Now, earlier, Sean Leigh spoke to election analyst Professor Sir John Curtis from the University of Strathclyde for his take on the results.
Well, there were two contests going on Thursday. One was between the Conservatives and Brexit, and it was essentially a battle amongst Leave voters. And the question was, to what extent would Leave voters, frustrated and disappointed at the government's failure to deliver Brexit, would end up being attracted by Nigel Farage's Brexit party? Well, the answer was rather a lot. It's pretty clear that well over half of Conservative voters switched towards Nigel Farage's party, which, with the 32% or so of the vote, it got pretty much what the opinion polls expected, and the Conservatives at 9%, if anything, were doing slightly worse. So very clear that voters on the Leave side of the argument strongly punishing the government, not least because many of them actually think that leaving without a deal would be preferable than the apparent endless extension that we're involved at the moment.
So in a sense they accepted Nigel Farage's argument that he pushed for the Brexit party.
Yeah. On the other side of the other battle that was going on was more on the Remain side of the debate, and it was between Labour and both the Liberal Democrats and the Greens for the Remain vote. Now, here the polls were very uncertain, and most of them had said actually Labour Party should still come second. But all of them were detecting that during the course of the campaign, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens seemed to be pulling away more and more Remain voters from the Labour Party. And the question was the much clearer, definitely we want a second referendum, and by the way, we are hoping that this will come up with a different result stance of the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Change UK would attract voters away from the Labour Party. Well, it now looks as though it did, not to the same extent that the Brexit party has drawn away votes from the Conservatives, but because this was in a sense a much less anticipated result, it's perhaps come as rather more of a shock to the Labour Party and perhaps surprise to Liberal Democrats in particular than is true on the other side of the debate. But it does therefore mean that on the one hand the Conservative Party is now going to have this debate, should the next Tory Prime Minister be embracing the idea of leaving without a deal, but equally should the Labour Party now move much more clearly to saying that it's in favour of a public vote on whatever Brexit deal emerges in order to shore up a Remain vote, which has always been the largest share of its vote, but which now seems at risk of being lost.
The Conservative leadership contender Boris Johnson was writing this morning that these results were clear, and what had to happen was that the government had to deliver on Brexit. Are they really that clear?
Well, no. I mean, it's true that around 35% of people voted for parties that were saying they would have no deal, and those undoubtedly represent a majority of Leave voters. But 35% is rather less than 50%. It's difficult to argue that this demonstrates that a majority of public are in favour. And in fact, the 33% is roughly what we know from opinion polls as the kind of proportion that's in favour of no deal. But equally, on the other side of the fence, I mean, some want to add the numbers up to say that actually 40%, rather more people voted for pro-referendum parties than for no-deal parties. Therefore, this was a mandate for a second referendum. Well, we can argue about the extent to which the SNP's vote is actually a Remain vote. It is predominantly, but not wholly. And if you take them out, actually, it's 35 35. But in any event, whether it's 35 or 40, it's still less than 50%. So I think the honest truth is that neither side can claim on the basis of these results that voters have sent a clear signal. It should be one thing or the other. The signal the voters have sent on both sides of the argument is that many of them are now sufficiently polarised as to which choice they prefer, that the two, as it were, extreme options of leaving without a deal and having a second referendum, as the polls are suggesting, two most popular options, and options that about which voters feel sufficiently strongly that many a person who might otherwise be expected to vote Conservative or Labour switch to one of the smaller parties.
How worried should the Conservative Party be by this result?
Well, I mean, point one to make is that we know from the opinion polls that not as many people would vote for the Brexit Party as it did in Thursday as would in general election. But we also know from the opinion polls that maybe 15, 16, 17, 18% currently would. Now, maybe that number will come down a bit as the European elections fade, except that, of course, Brexit's not going off the agenda anytime soon. And this may be a European election which gets remembered by voters rather more. And the truth is, I don't think the Conservative Party can afford the Brexit Party running at 15, 16, 17, 18%, because certainly all the opinion polls at the moment for Westminster voting intentions have the Conservative Party behind the Labour Party with no prospect of being able to form another administration. So to that extent, at least, yes, the Conservative Party do have to wait. And I think in particular, it's unlikely that that Brexit vote is going to disappear unless and until the Conservatives deliver Brexit. A second promissory note which says, look, you know, we're better able placed to deliver this than Nigel Farage is probably not going to work, and that therefore the next Tory Prime Minister is probably going to have to try to work out a way of delivering Brexit within the arithmetic of the current House of Commons, because the option of going to the country way was unlikely to look very attractive.
John Curtis, just love listening to him. Also love listening to Darren, though. He's got the weather.
Hello there. There's a bit of a chill in the air today. It's warm enough when the sun is out, but every now and again you may see clouds looking a little bit like this as the showers come rolling in. And it really is remaining mixed through the rest of the day. Some sunshine, some showers, which could be on the heavy side, and it will be feeling cooler as well. The most significant change in temperatures is going to be in the northeast of England, where with a northerly breeze today, temperatures are struggling to 11 or 12 degrees. Towards the southeast and East Anglia, it was 23 degrees yesterday, so a high here of 19 at best. Not too many showers along the south coast, the southwest of England, but quite blustery winds around here. Northerly winds coming in across Scotland, dragging down that colder air, and there are a sprinkling of showers across many parts of the country through the afternoon into the evening, and slowly easing down a bit across western areas overnight. Some clearer skies in Northern Ireland, and in rural parts it could be down to 3 or 4 degrees. Elsewhere, typically around about 6 to 8 Celsius. Now, Tuesday could be the chilliest day of the next few. We've got the colder air coming down on that north to northwesterly wind. By the time we get towards Wednesday, it's less cold air that's coming in from the Atlantic, but there'll be some cloud and some rain. For Northern Ireland, many western parts of Scotland, Wales, western areas of England, it may well be dry on Tuesday. There'll be more in the way of sunshine. Further east, particularly through the Midlands, eastern England, there'll be quite a few showers, and those could be heavy and thundery once again. And temperatures as a result will struggle to maybe 10 to 13 degrees. Further west and towards the southwest, 17 or 18. Gets chilly overnight, mind you, because this brief ridge of high pressure will kill off a lot of those showers. And then we drag in this Atlantic air. That means more cloud, higher humidity, and some outbreaks of rain too. There may be some early sunshine down the eastern side of the UK, but we're watching the cloud thickening from the west, some outbreaks of rain pushing across too. Not much rain at all in the southeast of England. Temperatures here still 17, maybe 18 degrees. Northern Scotland, though, seeing a mixture of sunshine and showers, not really getting that warmer air just yet, and not getting the rain, but it is going to be moving its way northwards. So through Thursday and Friday, we'll see the rain moving away from northern England, heading up into Scotland and Northern Ireland. Most places becoming dry over the weekend. Really warm in the southeast of England. Highs are likely to be in the mid-20s.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Sean Lay. This is a BBC News election special. With the Brexit Party a clear winner, the Liberal Democrats taking second place, and big losses for both the Conservatives and Labour. Nigel Farage says he's ready to fight a general election after his new Brexit party secured nearly a third of the vote and won 29 seats in the European Parliament.
If we don't leave on the 31st of October, then I think we can produce a result in the next general election that will start.
The Liberal Democrats, which backed a second referendum, surged into second place. Sir Vince Cable said it was a brilliant result they could now build on.
I'm Carrie Gracie at Westminster, where the two main parties have suffered heavy losses. The Conservatives are pushed into fifth place with a historic low of less than 10% of the vote. Home Secretary Sajid Javid becomes the latest MP to join the race to become the next Tory leader. And pressure on Jeremy Corbyn to back another referendum after Labour falls to third place overall. He says the party's position remains unchanged.
What this party does is supports an agreement with the European Union to prevent crashing out, supports putting that proposal, when agreed, to a public vote.
With Northern Ireland still to declare, in the next hour we'll bring you all the results, not just in the UK but across Europe as well, where turnout is up and the traditional parties have, as here, lost out to smaller ones. Hello, very good afternoon. Welcome to this BBC News special. In a major blow for the two largest political parties at Westminster, the Brexit Party has emerged as the clear winner in the European Parliament elections. Formed just a few weeks ago, the party led by Nigel Farage now has 29 seats in the next European Parliament after received almost 1/3 of the vote. Both Labour and the Conservatives posted some of their worst ever election results. The Liberal Democrats took second place on their anti-Brexit platform. Jeremy Corbyn is being pressed by some senior Labour figures to back another referendum, but he said the party's position hadn't changed, although it did have a responsibility to listen and to ensure that any Brexit deal is put to a public vote. Well, with only Northern Ireland still to declare, let's take a look at the results in detail. The Brexit Party gained by far the largest share of the vote, 32%. Liberal Democrats took second place. They were on 20%. That's up 13 points on the last time there were European Parliament elections back in 2014. Labour, though, came third with 14%, down 11 points. The Greens were in fourth place. Their 12% gives them their strongest performance in Europe for 30 years. The Conservatives, though, fell to an historic low. They took just 9% of the vote, pushing them into fifth place. In Scotland, the SNP dominated the poll with a big lead over the other political parties there. The UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage's old party, which won the European Parliament election in 2014, saw its vote fall heavily. It now has no MEPs. And the new Change UK party also failed to make an impression. It took just 3% of the vote. In all, then, there are 73 UK seats in the European Parliament up for grabs. The Brexit Party now has 29 of them, with the Liberal Democrats on just 16, up from one in 2014. Labour now has 10 MEPs, that's down 8. The Greens more than doubled its tally, with 7 MEPs in the new Parliament, up 4. The impact on the Conservative Party could not be clearer. It now has just 4 MEPs. That means it's lost 15. In Scotland, the SNP won 3 seats. In Wales, Plaid Cymru now has a seat after beating Labour into third place. Well, counting in Northern Ireland is underway. We are hoping for a declaration at some point in the next couple of hours. Now, though, let's take a look at the overall picture in the UK with our political correspondent Tom Barton. I should warn you that his report does contain some flash photography.
A party that only launched a few weeks ago.
Oh, they'll take up their seats, but hopefully not for too long.
Soon to be the joint largest from any country in the European Parliament. Nigel Farage, surrounded by more than 24 new Brexit Party MEPs, jubilant this afternoon and confident the result will lead to the hard exit from the EU that he's been campaigning for.
If we left the Brexit process to the Conservative and Labour parties, we would never, ever have got a Brexit that resembled anything like what we voted for in the referendum. This clearly will put pressure on them, pressure on the Conservative leadership contest. And the question is, are they actually going to respond to this pressure?
For the Lib Dems, it was a champagne moment. The party coming second with 20% of the vote. The Greens too leapt forward, beating the Conservatives to fourth place. This afternoon, the Lib Dem leader claiming victory for those who want to remain in the EU.
I think it's very clear from the big picture of the results. We now have a clear majority in the country who want to stop Brexit, stay in the European Union. As for our party, the Liberal Democrats, I think we've done brilliantly well. Taken together with the local government election results a few weeks ago, we're clearly now a major national force again.
The one thing that is clear from this result is that voters don't like the tightrope walk Brexit compromises that the two main parties have been offering up to now. What then does that mean for the future? Well, both for Labour and the Conservatives. It means that they're going to be under pressure to adopt simpler, clearer positions. Theresa May today sharing her disappointment, saying the result shows the importance of finding a Brexit deal and hoping it focuses minds in Parliament.
Good morning.
The result is focusing the minds of those hoping to replace her, like the Home Secretary Sajid Javid, who joined the race today. For many of the contenders, though, the message from voters is a simple one.
I'm deeply saddened by the fact that so many candidates and so many activists worked so hard and we didn't get the result that we wanted. And one message is clear from these results. We absolutely need to deliver Brexit. I led the campaign to take Britain out of the European Union, and we must honour that referendum result.
In Scotland, Labour has been wiped out in the face of an SNP surge, while in Wales, the party was forced into third place. The pressure now on the leadership, including from some senior voices, to back another referendum. Jeremy Corbyn today promising to listen.
What you have from me today is a commitment that our party is listening to its members and its supporters and reaching out to other parties across the House of Commons to prevent a crashing out from the European Union with no deal. A commitment that the future will of course be put to a public vote, as we have already proposed in Parliament.
These results providing no easy answers for the parties when they return to Westminster next week. Tom Barton, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, one of the big questions raised by Brexit has been that of the future of the United Kingdom, and we've had some news on that in the last hour or so. Scotland's First Minister, the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, celebrating her party's success there, has said that the second half of next year will be the right time to try to hold another independence referendum. Ms Sturgeon also said that although the Brexit party had made big gains, including in Scotland, the advance of Remain supporting parties would, she hoped, lead to a push Labour into supporting another EU membership referendum.
Clearly the Conservatives are moving in a hard Brexit, possibly no-deal Brexit direction. On the other side of that, I think Labour, Jeremy Corbyn, will come under enormous pressure because of their dire results in the European elections to back a second EU referendum. So there is definitely a big risk of a no-deal Brexit, but there is also, I think, the real opportunity to get a second EU referendum and hopefully win an outcome that has the UK staying in the EU, and that's definitely there to play for.
Well, now let's get reaction to last night's results. Carrie Gracie is at Westminster.
Thanks, Sean. So let's start with Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn facing increasing pressure, of course, from senior members of his party to back another referendum on Brexit, with his own shadow chancellor saying it's the only way through the deadlock. John McDonnell said the country was now facing the prospect of a Brexit extremist becoming the next Prime Minister, meaning the UK faced the prospect of no deal.
So we're in a situation now, is where do we go from here? And we're faced with the potential of a Brexiteer extremist almost certainly becoming leader of the Tory party, whether it's Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab or some of that ilk. So we're faced with the prospect of a no deal, which could have catastrophic consequences for our economy. A Tory leader being elected on that basis, no matter what the damage to jobs and the economy. So we've got to prevent that. How do we do that? Well, of course, we want a general election, but realistically, after last night, there aren't many Tory MPs that are going to vote for a general election. It'll be like turkeys voting for Christmas. So our best way of doing that, I think, is going back to the people in a referendum, and I think that's what our members want. So we're saying quite clearly, if there can be a deal, great, but it needs to go back to the people. If it's a no deal, we've got to block it. And the one way of doing that is, I think, going back to the people and arguing the case against it, because it could be catastrophic for our economy. It's not just me saying that. It's Philip Hammond, the Chancellor. It's others across the parties now that are saying that, independent economists as well. And I'm not willing to stand by and let my constituents lose their jobs or have their livelihoods undermined by this.
So are you saying then it's a referendum under any circumstances, that's the only way through now?
I think it is, yeah.
John McDonnell there. Well, let's speak to Labour MP Peter Dowd, who's the MP for Bootle. Thanks for joining us, Mr Dowd. Are you fed up with constructive ambiguity? Is it time for a second referendum announcement from your party leader?
I don't think it's a question of being sick of so-called constructive ambiguity. What we've been trying to do as a party for some periods of time is move out of this binary, polarised position. And I think that the elections yesterday were a proxy on another referendum. And we've said this all along, if we have to have another referendum, I prefer a general election. If you have to have another referendum in due course to ratify a deal or have Remain on the ballot paper, well, that's something that will no doubt happen, I suspect.
I'm interested that you still prefer a general election even after results which were so very bad for your own party.
Yes, but because a general election is going to widen this debate up, because whatever happens in a referendum, we're still going to be faced with these tensions and polarisations. And what we've got to do is to have a broader debate on how you want to see the future of the country, whether it's in the European Union or outside the European Union, with a deal. And the only way to do that is a general election, because this stalemate, this polarisation, this binary position will just continue ad infinitum, and that's why I want a general election.
And yet, if you go back to voters at a general election with a position which is as unclear in the view of many as the one with which you approach the European elections, aren't you just going to get doors slammed in your face and a result like you got last night?
Well, I don't believe that's the case, because what we've had for the past, 2.5 or 3 years is Brexit being completely and utterly polarised. And the shame of it is we haven't been able to move on to the whole question of whether issues around NHS cuts, the economy, education, tuition fees, social care, none of that, whilst I've been in the House of Commons for the past few years, has actually had any airtime whatsoever. And we've got, as politicians, to get that back onto the agenda. And we can talk about Brexit till the cows come home, but we've got to get some of those other policy issues onto the agenda, and I'm quite happy to do that on the doorstep.
So on the doorstep, will you be saying to your voters, and will you be saying when you get back here to Westminster to your other MP colleagues, it's that we have to leave with a deal or we have to stop the process?
Well, I think that we preferably leave with a good deal, and that's where we're at. But we've really struggled to get that position for the past 3 years, frankly, because the Prime Minister, I don't want to get into the party politics of this, frankly, the Prime Minister hasn't been willing to talk to anybody. We are and have been, and that's what we've got to pursue. We've got to be able to have this sensible, constructive dialogue and conversation about the future of the country. And it can't all just be about the narrow confines of Brexit. As important as that is, it cannot just be about that.
Peter Dowd, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. And with me now, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. So we've still got some talking about, the idea of leaving with a good deal, but everybody else is taking one path or another, seems to be bifurcating. Do you think the prospect of a deal is even there at all now, Vicky?
I mean, it seems hard, doesn't it? I mean, it does all depend, of course, on the Tory leadership contest. We've had another person throwing the hat into the ring today, Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, but they'll all be under pressure to take a pretty hardline view, because if you're a Conservative trying to get elected as the leader, You've got to appeal to the Tory grassroots. We know what they think, most of them. And now they feel they've got a new enemy. They've got Nigel Farage back, and he is obviously taking a lot of votes from them. So that's going to be crucial. When it comes to Labour, of course, a lot of talk about the second referendum. Jeremy Corbyn clearly coming under pressure from many. We've got Welsh Labour, Scottish Labour saying, OK, now is the time to be much less equivocal about all of this and just come out and say it's a second referendum in all circumstances. And in some cases, they say they would, campaign to remain. But there's a problem with that. There aren't numbers in the House of Commons. Will there be any legislation between now and the date they were due to leave the end of October? How do they get to the point where they can bring that about? It looks pretty difficult.
And on the European side, there's plenty happening there. Is there going to be anybody to talk to about the terms of getting out with a deal before October the 31st?
Yeah, I mean, people like Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, was saying that actually any Tory leadership contender who says they want to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, firstly, the EU have said no to that. Now, they might budge on that. There's no evidence that they will. Secondly, the timings in all of this, although October the 31st seems a long time away, it's really not. If you think about a new leader being in place by end of July, there's then obviously the parliamentary recess, the European Commission is not around, and they're not going to have a new Commission in place really until the autumn. It doesn't leave much time. And yet you can hear from people like Boris Johnson warning today, saying those Conservatives who've abandoned the party, gone to the Brexit party, he says they may never come back if Brexit is delayed once again. And Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, suggesting the whole crisis could actually do away with the Tory party altogether.
And is there a sense that, in a way, the results strengthen the government's hand in dealing with Europe by saying, look, we really will go without a deal. Look at what we've got on the right of us. Look what we've got to the left of us. This is a very meaningful thing now. So that kind of game of bluff becomes stronger?
Maybe, although they might look, Europe might look and say, well, look at the Liberal Democrats, look at the Greens and Plaid, look at the parties that actually are calling for Brexit to stop altogether, for the second referendum. They might think, well, actually, that's more likely. But again, it's the idea of what a new Tory leader will do. And again, from yesterday, Philip Hammond not ruling out the possibility of Tory MPs contemplating voting down their own Prime Minister if they were to forge ahead with a no-deal Brexit. It's pretty incredible circumstances.
Vicky, thank you. So that's it from us for now. More in a little while. Back to you, Sean, now in the studio, though.
Carrie, thanks very much. Let's take a look at the results across Europe now and the spread of seats in the new European Parliament, which meets at the beginning of July. The big centre-right and centre-left blocs, they've lost their combined majority. Big increase in support for Liberals, Greens and Nationalists. Pro-EU parties likely to remain in a majority, but probably that bloc will only stick together if it can win new allies, possibly the Liberals and Greens. Negotiations likely to continue in the next few weeks, of course, with the Nationalists, as here in the UK, doing particularly well in Italy and in France. Let's talk now to our Europe correspondent. He's Gavin Lee and he's in Westminster. Gavin, as the dust begins to as the dust begins to settle on these results, what's the feeling there? Because it's by no means the case, is it, that's just the UK that's given a bit of a not a Europe as we've had in the past message to the people making the decisions there?
No, this is a whole new, diverse European Parliament, a far more pluralistic one, some say a far more fragmented one. But what's happened, if you think about the 751 MEPs in the European Parliament, the way they get things done is by majority. So if it's for the scrapping of mobile roaming charges, for example, you have to build coalitions. Now, traditionally, for 4 decades, as you just pointed to, Sean, there has been the centre-right, the centre-left, the European People's Party and the Social Democrat Party, which, Labour, for example, in the UK joins the Social Democrats, and other parties collect together, they've been the dominant force. So what we've seen this time is the ebbing away of that. They've been the weakest that they have been in the history of the European Union, but they're still the 2 biggest parties. But they will have to work with, well, primarily the Liberal Party, the Lib Democrats across the EU. They've got their best performance yet. 37 extra seats collectively. You combine the Lib Dems in the UK, you look at Emmanuel Macron, the standard bearer for a changed EU, but the federalist EU, who lost out to the far right, Rassemblement National, the national rally of Marine Le Pen, but enough to give Liberals a big boost collectively. Then you have the flowering of the Green Party, that again picking up more seats than they've ever had before. So there'll have to be more groups talking to each other to get things done. They have enough pro-EU parties to outrank and outflank the far right, the nationalist parties, but they've got their best growth as well. An extra 20 seats collectively. Big gains in Italy, being the sort of standard bearer for those wanting more national powers. Anti-migrant stance from Matteo Salvini as well. He says he's collectively going to bring about 12 countries together with their far right and nationalist parties. We're yet to see if the Brexit Party decides to join that group.
Gavin Lee in Brussels, thanks very much. Now, the SNP has comfortably topped the poll in the European elections. The party won almost 38% of the vote in Scotland, increasing its number of MEPs from 2 to 3. The Brexit Party, though, was in second place with 15% of the vote. It took one seat. Liberal Democrats gained 14%, the Conservatives on 12%. Labour came fifth with less than 10% of the vote. That's down from 26% just 5 years ago. And it's remained a big debate in Scotland about what Scottish Labour did in supporting the UK party's position. With me now is our Scotland correspondent, James Shaw. James, let me start by asking you about this question, because there's been some pretty damning criticism of Labour's election strategy in Scotland, notably from some MPs writing in the Edinburgh Evening News saying this was an election campaign with the biggest issue facing our generation, but Labour offered nothing but ambiguity. Jeremy Corbyn and Richard Leonard, the Labour leader in Scotland, basically stuck their heads in the Brexit sand because they can't lead.
Well, we have heard from Richard Leonard, the leader of Scottish Labour today, and what he has said in essence is that he and his party need to go away and think. They need to regroup. They need to understand why these results were so disastrous for them in Scotland, coming in fifth place, their share of the vote going from 26% down to less than 10. But what he has also said when pressed is that he has rethought his view on whether there should be another referendum on membership of the European Union. And it now seems pretty clear that he is dead set in saying that he thinks that there should be another referendum. And as far as I see it, that does set him slightly in a different place from the national leadership of the Labour Party in London. So that's a kind of moving situation where Labour's position is changing. When it comes to the other parties' reactions to the results, of course it was very good for the Scottish National Party, and they seem to be using that good result as a platform to move ahead with their desire to have another referendum on a different subject, on Scottish independence. So Nicola Sturgeon has said today that she is going to put forward legislation in the Scottish Parliament which will start to enable that to happen, and she has also said that she would like to see it in the second half of next year. Now, we have to bear in mind that the UK government has set its face firmly against another independence referendum. It has to authorise that referendum for it to be legally binding. So in theory it's possible for there to be one, but it wouldn't have the strength of law in terms of what would be required for Scotland to become independent if people voted yes. Of course they voted no in 2014. So that sets the Scottish Government and the UK Government at loggerheads for the foreseeable future on this issue of a second independence referendum. And the Scottish Tories have accused the SNP of what they describe as fraudulent behaviour. They said that they encouraged people to vote SNP to support staying within the EU, but now the SNP is using it to push ahead with its independence agenda.
James Shaw in Glasgow with the latest position in Scotland. Let's go to Wales, where the Brexit Party won the largest share of the vote in the Parliament elections. Mr Farage's party won almost a third with 32%. That gives it 2 MEPs. Plaid Cymru came second with 20% of the vote, holding on to a seat there. Labour in third place with 15%. Lib Dems close behind on 14%. The Tories lost their 1 seat and dropped to 5th in the vote, just ahead of the Greens, UKIP and Change UK. Let's talk now to our Wales political editor, Felicity Evans, who's in Cardiff for us. And Felicity, it's the same picture, isn't it, as we've seen in Scotland, with people in Welsh Labour now kicking against what had been the leadership line on a referendum.
You're absolutely right, Sean. That is true. You know, Welsh Labour has been an election-winning machine over the last 100 years. Only once in a century had they failed to top a Wales-wide poll. How different do things look today when they got a drubbing? They came third. They were beaten into second place by the Nationalist Party Plaid Cymru, the first time in Plaid's history that it's ever managed to beat Labour in a Wales-wide poll. And talking to sources within Welsh Labour, they were pointing the finger at the UK leadership and suggesting that the party's ambivalence over Brexit was to blame for their poor showing here. Though it must be said that the new Welsh Labour leader, Mark Drakeford, has made some decisions and judgments of his own over the course of the last few months. He's been under pressure from many within Welsh Labour to come out more strongly in favour of a referendum. He declined to do that. He stuck very closely to the Jeremy Corbyn line. Today, though, we have seen movement from him on that. He has issued a statement in which he has said that he thinks the Welsh public should get the final say on any Brexit deal. And for Plaid Cymru, well, the big question for them now is whether they can use this momentum going forward, looking ahead to the next Assembly elections in 2 years' time.
Felicity Evans in Cardiff, thanks very much. Let's cross to Emma Vardy, who's in Magherafelt for the Northern Ireland count, which, Emma, is still going on, is it?
It is, because they started a little later than many other places in the UK, started counting 8 o'clock this morning rather than last night. We have had one seat confirmed, that is the Democratic Unionist Party's Diane Dodds, but some counting still going on to really confirm those other 2 seats, although it really looks to be pretty much a done deal here now. It's expected to be Sinn Féin's Martina Anderson with that other seat. And the third seat, the really interesting story of the day, looking strongly on course now to be taken by the Alliance Party, by Naomi Long. And the reason why that's interesting here in Northern Ireland, because it breaks the tradition of the last 40 years in which all 3 of Northern Ireland's seats have been taken by 2 unionist candidates and a nationalist candidate. But this changes all of that, because the Alliance Party are a centre ground party, neither designating themselves as unionist nor nationalist, not taking or being part of one of the 2 big community tribes, if you like, and attracting cross-community votes here in Northern Ireland. So really bucking the trend of the last 40 years. Why? Well, we've seen an increase in support for the centre ground to some degree more recently in Northern Ireland, something that centre ground parties have struggled to do because there is that very clear community divide here. So a huge result for the Alliance Party, more than doubling the votes they picked up last European elections in 2014. But also playing into this, of course, is Brexit. Alliance were campaigning very strongly for Remain, campaigning for a second referendum, and Northern Ireland, of course, is a place which voted to remain in the European Union. So that the strong vote for Alliance here today being taken again as another sign of the Remain voters here in Northern Ireland. So really it will be quite a remarkable moment when that is confirmed, as it's expected to be in the next hour or so. Slightly different voting system here in Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. They use the single transferable vote system, partly because of Northern Ireland's unique history, to ensure there is a representation for unionists and nationalists. It means the votes take a little bit longer to count. It's a little bit more technical, but at the moment the 3 leaders, the 3 winners if you like, are pretty strongly on course to take those seats, and we'll just be waiting for the confirmation of the last 2 seats when the next rounds of voting is announced, probably in the next hour or so.
Emma Vardy in Magherafelt in Northern Ireland, thank you very much, and we will of course bring you that result as soon as we get it from Northern Ireland. In the next half hour we'll have plenty more reaction and analysis. We'll also be hearing from 2 MEPs from different parties who will be representing the same region in the European Parliament when it sits in July, and who have the same name. That could get a bit confusing. Let's get something a little less confusing. It's the weather prospects with Ben Rich.
Hello. It was a bank holiday Monday. I suppose mixed weather was to be expected. The kind of day where we have blue skies overhead 1 minute and the next A big shower cloud came along and gave a drenching. Some of those showers will continue as we head through the night into the early hours of Tuesday, albeit with some clear spells in between. Where the winds fall lightest across Scotland, here quite a chilly night, temperatures between 2 and 6 degrees. Some of the showers that remain here could be wintry over high ground. Further south we keep more of a breeze and it's not going to be quite as cold. Into tomorrow, it is another day of sunshine and showers, but the showers most likely across central and eastern parts of England for a time, across eastern and southern Scotland. Some more showery rain into the far north of Scotland later in the day, but elsewhere we see some spells of sunshine with the winds coming down from the northwest. Not an especially warm day. Highs of 11 to 17 degrees in most areas, but those temperatures will climb significantly as we head into next weekend. In southern parts, further north and west, we see some rain at times.
Watching BBC News, we're going to have more reaction and analysis of the European Parliament election results shortly. First, though, let's get an update on all the day's sporting action. Here's Jane Dougal. Evening to you, Jane.
Hello, good evening. But you can find out more on all those stories on the BBC Sport website. That's bbc.co.uk/sport. Back to Carrie Gracie at Westminster now.
Thanks, Jane. Now then, let's get back to the politics and one of the more unusual stories in this EU election. We can speak now to two newly elected MEPs representing the South East region. They're from very different parties, but they share the same name. The Brexit Party's Alexandra Phillips joins us from Westminster, and the Green Party's Alexandra Phillips joins us from Brighton. So Alexandra Phillips, who is a Brexit Party member, could you raise your hand now, just so that we can just be absolutely clear? OK, thank you. And so that makes you the Green in Brighton. Alexandra Phillips, why did this happen? Why didn't one or other of you change your name? Have you actually discussed this?
Well, you know, we both actually also acknowledged that our middle names also begin with the letter L, so I have no idea how the post room in the European Parliament is going to cope with this. But, you know, democracy throws up some interesting results.
Well, this is a very interesting one, as it means that the South East has more MEPs called Alexandra Phillips than it has MEPs that are Labour or Conservative. Other Alexandra Phillips, the Green one, how do you distinguish yourself, other than policies, from the other Alexandra Phillips?
Very clear divide between the two of us because we're on polar opposites of the political spectrum. You know, Greens are clearly a pro-Remain party, but we're also anti-austerity and we want to fight climate change. So we've stood on these elections on that platform and we've done very, very well. We had a phenomenal evening last night.
And so do you, I mean, apart from party politics, does the fact that you both share a name mean there's any possibility that you can actually bridge this divide in any way between your political stances? Does it help?
Do you know, I think we're going to have to learn to bridge the divide because we're going to have to deal with each other every single day just to exchange envelopes and say, oh, I've got an email that's meant for you. And I'm looking forward to it. Do you know, I think there's a lot that we will have in common, I'm sure, like stopping the travelling circus to Strasbourg every month. The Brexit Party is going to be very much a broad church in terms of the positions we take. We're just very pro-democracy and want to respect that referendum result. But I'm looking forward to working with my namesake.
I respect both of your keenness to get your political agendas across. What about mistaken identity? I'm concerned that the voters may have voted for one or other of you while thinking that they were voting for the other one. Now, do you think there's any risk of that? Let's have Brighton Green, Alexandra Phillips.
Yeah, I think luckily this is an election where people clearly vote for political parties, and that's where they put their effort. There were 10 names next to those political parties in very small print. So I think we were just lucky in this system that people didn't get confused. But had it been a general election or local elections, then it would have caused a lot of confusion, I'm sure.
And the same Alexandra Phillips, the Brighton one, the Green one, do you share the other one's determination to actually at least work at a practical level together so that you can kind of make sure you both get the right post?
Well, you know, I'm sure that there will be some things where, you know, constituents email one over the other, and that's already happened. And we've exchanged conversations on Twitter. We've spoken to each other face to face, and I'm sure that will continue. Yes.
Alexandra, Brexit Party Alexandra, do you think there's been any confusion of identity, and do you think there will be, other than the exchange of emails and letters in future?
Well, who knows? Definitely on the bureaucratic front and the administration front, there's going to be lots of confusion. I can tell you right now, I've already worked in the European Parliament, they're going to go into meltdown about this. As for politically, I think, the thing is about being from such different parts of the political spectrum, as my namesake said. I think it would be, unlikely that people are going to mix us up when it comes to policies and what we represent. But, I actually think it's a wonderful narrative, and let's see what we can do together in this sort of crazy situation to bring a little humour into the job.
Excellent idea. Alexandra Phillips and Alexandra Phillips, congratulations to both of you for your overnight victories, and good luck in your new roles.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, as you've been hearing, the Brexit Party topped the polls in every part of the UK, apart from Scotland, that was won by the SNP, and London, which was won by the Liberal Democrats. Northern Ireland, as we've been hearing from Emma, still left to declare, but Rita Chakrabarty's been crunching through all the numbers, looking at all the results. Let's take a look at what she's got to say.
This has been an election of stark contrast, with the Brexit Party putting in a very impressive performance, but strong performances too from the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and a real disaster for Labour and the Conservatives. Let's take a look at some of the details. Castle Point here in the east of England. This was one of the Brexit Party's strongest results. Look at that, 59% of the vote here in a very Leave voting area, but a really, really strong performance, leaving all the other parties behind there. Brexit Party also coming out on top in Windsor and Maidenhead. That's Theresa May's constituency, her own backyard. They came out on top in St Helens here in the northwest, beating Labour in their own heartland. Look at that. Brexit Party on 35% and the Labour Party on 22%. For the Liberal Democrats, it was also a very good night. Here in Elmbridge, for example, they topped the poll by 39%. Now, this is an area that had been Conservative for the last 3 European elections. And if we take a little look at the change in the share of the vote, look at that. The Conservatives plummeting by 31% to the benefit of the Liberal Democrats. For the Lib Dems, it was a great night in London. They topped the poll in London, and that included Islington, which is Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. That tale of Labour woe was reproduced in Scotland, where the SNP took almost all the areas, all the local authority areas that there are, and in Blaenau Gwent, Labour also suffered there at the hands of the Brexit Party. One word for the Greens, who came top in 3 areas, and that included Bristol as well, and they'll be very happy with their performance at this election. I think the takeaway, though, from these elections is the result for the Conservative Party, who on 9% of the vote share came 5th in the table. And there is one remarkable fact for the governing party, which is that in the whole of the United Kingdom, they failed to top the vote in any single local authority area in this entire election.
Rita Chakrabarty. Well, with me now, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, because we've got some word from Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, that's right. We heard from him this morning, but now he's written a letter to all Labour MPs. Now, we know throughout the day he's been coming under huge pressure to really be more explicit about Labour backing another referendum in all circumstances, not just to stop what he calls a bad Tory deal. Now, he has written to the Parliamentary Labour Party saying it's clear that the deadlock in Parliament can now only be broken by the issue going back to the people through a general election or a public vote. We are ready to support a public vote on any deal. Now, this chimes with what Emily Thornberry was saying last night. She saying that she was talking to voters in her constituency in London who were saying they were voting Liberal Democrat. The party hadn't been clear enough. The Welsh Labour Party coming out and saying, yeah, we're going to go down this road now. and those in Scotland too. So huge pressure. The Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, has been pretty clear to the BBC about what he thinks. Now, some will say this is too late. If you look at what might happen in the next few weeks, we will have a new Tory leader, new Conservative Prime Minister, who may well want to go down the route of a no-deal Brexit. And it's quite hard to achieve a second referendum. There may not be any more legislation to amend in order to get all of this. And actually, there's only going to be about 2 or 3 weeks of Parliament sitting between the time of a new Tory Prime Minister and that exit date of October the 31st. So there'll be Labour MPs saying, well, thank goodness he's being clearer, but actually it may be a little bit too late.
And is there something constructive that he as leader of the opposition can do in Westminster to make it happen?
Well, I suppose, I mean, he's talking here about, you know, getting another kind of deal, but I think some will say that ship has sailed. You know, Theresa May tried all of that, it didn't work. Now, is it possible that a Conservative leader could come back, change the dynamic? You know, sometimes just having a different person there can change the dynamic. But, you know, if you look at the Tory leadership contenders at the moment, they're talking much more about just getting out at the end of October.
So just to be very clear, Jeremy Corbyn is talking about, in a way, the confirmatory or confirmatory referendum that others were talking about earlier. He's not talking about a second referendum, which is a no-deal Brexit or a no Brexit.
It's not entirely clear from this, and I think that's the first question we would probably want to ask him when we see him, and that's what a lot of Labour supporters are saying, that is it that? Is it just that, you know, we would, and how would Labour campaign, for example? What would the question be? Would it be no deal or revoke? You know, it becomes very complicated at that point, but I think some Labour MPs will think, well, this is at least a first step, but he's had to be really pushed into doing it.
Vicky, thank you. That's it from us for now. More shortly. Back to you, Sean, though.
Carrie Gracie at Westminster. Thanks very much, Carrie. Well, as we've been hearing, the Brexit Party topped the polls in every part of the UK, apart from Scotland, which was won by the SNP, and the London region by the Liberal Democrats. Northern Ireland, of course, is still left to declare. Let's talk now, though, about what the Brexit Party might mean for the way the European Union operates. With me is Chris Morris, our reality check correspondent. We haven't had a lot of detail from Nigel Farage's new party about what it will do next. What are they likely to be pressing for?
Yeah, it's interesting. We know they didn't have a manifesto. There's very little detail on their website about detailed policy priorities. Obviously, we know they want to leave the European Union. How they want to do that is another matter. Now, one of the things that Nigel Farage has said repeatedly during this election campaign is that he wants a clean break Brexit. That's the term he uses, and it's interesting. He uses this term rather than no deal. In fact, in the slightly chaotic press conference he had an hour or so ago, he said there's no such thing as no deal. I think clean break probably sounds a bit more upbeat, a bit more optimistic. The fact is, it still means that if that happens, there would be a fairly sudden rupture with the European Union, and a lot of the laws that govern our relationship with the EU and have done for 40 or more years would suddenly disappear. What else would that clean break mean? Well, one of the things that he has said specifically, and is on a pledge card which the Brexit Party produced during the referendum, was, remember the £39 billion that was part of the withdrawal agreement that the governments agreed to pay the EU over a number of years. Now, Farage says he will not pay that amount. The Brexit Party would refuse to pay it altogether, which won't exactly create a congenial atmosphere with the European Union at a time when he says the main thing we want to do is leave the EU under what he describes as World Trade Organization terms.
So, I mean, it's interesting, that phrase, World Trade Organization terms, because it's one that's been used quite a lot by Brexiters in the Conservative Party as well, and even some in the Labour Party who take the view that actually we can walk away. We just have, it's like a fallback, isn't it? Is that a fair way to describe it in international terms?
Yeah, I mean, get used to this term, because we're going to hear a lot of it in the Tory leadership campaign as well. What does it really mean? In many ways, it doesn't mean very much, because the basic rules of the World Trade Organizations are the very, very baseline, the building blocks of international trade on which you then construct other things.
But basically, it's kind of a level playing field on which you can then build,
but
in theory.
But the most basic level. Now, the Brexit Party, and Mr Farage says it's fine. There's something called Article 24, which means that we can continue to trade with the EU without any tariffs or taxes on goods going across the border. Now, the trouble with that is that to have an agreement under Article 24, you need both sides to agree. And at the same time, of course, the Brexit Party is saying we're happy to leave without any agreement. So that's a bit of a problem. Then, of course, you have to say, well, if you leave without a deal, you do need to start talking sooner rather than later about what comes next. Mr Farage says the EU will come running for a trade deal. But if you look at the EU's own priorities, the things that the other 27 countries have agreed upon as their priority in the event of a no-deal Brexit, they're quite familiar. The things they say they want to talk about first, before they start talking about future trade: the divorce deal, the financial settlement, the Irish border and citizens' rights. Precisely those things which are contained and which form the heart of the withdrawal agreement negotiated by Theresa May's government, which has already been defeated 3 times in the House of Commons.
You've been a Brussels correspondent for many years. You were out there watching Nigel Farage for many of those years.
He was there for longer than I was, and he's going back.
It's worth remembering he's now into his 20th year as a member of the European Parliament. For all the kind of what one might call rhetoric and performance politics, is he a man who at times has done deals, has actually sort of been able to work with people, even though there might be a bit of shouting across the chamber, sort of in committees, and make the system work when he thinks it can be of advantage to the UK?
I don't think he'd be fine with me saying no.
Yeah.
He doesn't go to the European Parliament looking to make deals. That's not what he's done. His attendance record is not great on committees he's been part of. He basically used the European Parliament as a bit of a bully pulpit. Because
he has said on this occasion that he thinks that as a result of the Brexit Party's performance, that actually the UK government should involve the Brexit Party in the next stage of negotiations.
Yes, he wants Brexit Party MEPs to be part of a negotiating team for a deal that he doesn't want to do. But that's not going to happen. I mean, if they're not in government, Brexit Party MEPs are not going to be taking a role in the negotiation. In fact, the only direct role they would probably play was if a withdrawal agreement ever got through the House of Commons, it would then go in turn to the European Parliament to be ratified, and Brexit Party MEPs would be faced potentially with voting against a form of Brexit, because it's a form of Brexit which they don't like.
Chris Morris, our reality check correspondent, thank you very much for that. Now, we've given you most of the results. I should say one result we've had, Emma Vardy referred to it earlier, is that of the first of the 3 Northern Ireland seats has been won by the DUP. There's 2 other seats still to be declared, likely, though, as she said, to fall to 2 other parties, including the Alliance Party. The rest of the election results, though, we had some time ago, and I spoke to Sir John Curtis, who is really the man when it comes to picking apart election statistics from the University of Strathclyde. He's been here with us at the BBC, and this is his overview of the European Parliament election results.
Well, there were 2 contests going on Thursday. One was between the Conservatives and Brexit, and it was essentially a battle amongst Leave voters. And the question was, to what extent would Leave voters, frustrated and disappointed at the government's failure to deliver Brexit, would end up being attracted by Nigel Farage's Brexit Party? Well, the answer was rather a lot. It's pretty clear that well over half of Conservative voters switched towards Nigel Farage's party, which, with the 32% or so of the vote, it got pretty much what the opinion polls expected, and the Conservatives at 9%, if anything, were doing slightly worse. So very clear that voters on the Leave side of the argument strongly punishing the government, not least because many of them actually think that leaving without a deal would be preferable than the apparent endless extension that we're involved in at the moment.
So in a sense, they accepted Nigel Farage's argument that he pushed with the Brexit Party.
Yeah. On the other side of the other battle that was going on was more on the Remain side of the debate, and it was between Labour and both the Liberal Democrats and the Greens for the Remain vote. Now, here the polls were very uncertain, and most of them had said actually the Labour Party should still come second, but all of them were detecting that during the course of the campaign, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens seemed to be pulling away more and more Remain voters from the Labour Party. And the question was the much clearer, definitely, we want a second referendum, and by the way, we are hoping that this will come up with a different result stance of the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Change UK would attract voters away from the Labour Party. Well, it now looks as though it did, not to the same extent that the Brexit Party has drawn away votes from the Conservatives, but because this was, in a sense, a much less anticipated result, it's perhaps come as rather more of a shock to the Labour Party, and perhaps surprise to Liberal Democrats in particular, than is true on the other side of the debate. But it does therefore mean that on the one hand, the Conservative Party is now going to have this debate: should the next Tory Prime Minister be embracing the idea of leaving without a deal, but equally should the Labour Party now move much more clearly to saying that it's in favour of a public vote on whatever Brexit deal emerges in order to shore up a Remain vote, which has always been the largest share of its vote, but which now seems at risk of being lost.
The Conservative leadership contender Boris Johnson was writing this morning that these results were clear and what had to happen was that the government had to deliver on Brexit. Are they really that clear?
Well, no. I mean, it's true that around 35% of people voted for parties that were saying they would have no deal, and those undoubtedly represent a majority of Leave voters. But 35% is rather less than 50%. It's difficult to argue that this demonstrates that a majority of public are in favour. And in fact, the 33% is roughly what we know from opinion polls as the kind of proportion that's in favour of no deal. But equally on the other side of the fence, I mean, some want to add the numbers up to say that actually 40%, rather more people voted for pro-referendum parties than for no-deal parties. Therefore, this was a mandate for a second referendum. Well, we can argue about the extent to which the SNP's vote is actually a Remain vote. It is predominantly, but not wholly. And if you take them out, actually it's 35-35. But in any event, whether it's 35 or 40, it's still less than 50%. So I think the honest truth is that neither side can claim on the basis of these results that voters have sent a clear signal. It should be one thing or the other. The signal the voters have sent on both sides of the argument is that many of them are now sufficiently polarised as to which choice they prefer, that the two, as it were, extreme options of leaving without a deal and having a second referendum, as the polls are suggesting, two most popular options, and options that about which voters feel sufficiently strongly that many a person who might otherwise be expected to vote Conservative or Labour switch to one of the smaller parties.
How worried should the Conservative Party be by this result?
Well, I mean, point one to make is that we know from the opinion polls that not as many people would vote for the Brexit Party as it did in Thursday as would in general election. But we also know from the opinion polls that maybe 15, 16, 17, 18% currently would. Now, maybe that number will come down a bit as the European elections fade, except that, of course, Brexit's not going off the agenda anytime soon. And this may be a European election which gets remembered by voters rather more. And the truth is, I don't think the Conservative Party can afford the Brexit Party running at 15, 16, 17, 18%, because certainly all the opinion polls at the moment for Westminster voting intentions have the Conservative Party behind the Labour Party with no prospect of being able to form another administration. So to that extent, at least, yes, the Conservative Party do have to wait. And I think in particular, it's unlikely that that Brexit vote is going to disappear unless and until the Conservatives deliver Brexit. A second promissory note which says, look, you know, we're better able placed to deliver this than Nigel Farage is probably not going to work, and that therefore the next Tory Prime Minister is probably going to have to try to work out a way of delivering Brexit within the arithmetic of the current House of Commons, because the option of going to the country was unlikely to look very attractive.
There you go, the last word on the European Parliament elections, appropriately from Sir John Curtis from the University of Strathclyde. Coming up in just a few minutes, a full summary of all the news in the 6 o'clock news with Hugh Edwards. Don't forget you can find all the results whenever you want them on the BBC News website. Thanks very much for your company this afternoon. Let's take a look at the weather now with Ben Rich.
Hello there. It was a bank holiday Monday. I suppose mixed weather was to be expected. We had blue skies and sunshine for some of the time, but also some pretty impressive shower clouds. That was the scene in Norfolk. I had a beautiful shot from one of our weather watchers here in East Dunbartonshire. Some of these clouds did produce some outbreaks of rain, as you can see from the radar picture. Quite a scattering of showers across the UK. Some particularly heavy ones drifted across parts of Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northwest England, Wales and the Midlands. And as we go through this evening and tonight, we'll continue to see some of those showers drifting through at times. Some clear spells as well, where the winds fall lightest across Scotland. Here it will be relatively chilly by the first part of Tuesday morning, temperatures between 2 and 6 degrees. Further south, it stays a little bit breezy, and as a consequence, it won't be quite as chilly. So we go into tomorrow, and it is, to all intents and purposes, another day of sunshine and showers, but the showers perhaps focused across eastern parts of the UK, from the Midlands into eastern England. for a time at least across the southeast of Scotland. Also some showers pushing back into the far north of Scotland as the day wears on. In between, some spells of sunshine, but with the winds generally coming down from the northwest, it's not going to be a particularly warm feeling day. Highs of 10 to 17 degrees. Tuesday night likely to be chilly, a touch of frost in places under a ridge of high pressure. But as we move into Wednesday, well, here's our next change. A frontal system pushing in from the west. This will introduce some outbreaks of rain into Northern Ireland, Wales, parts of the southwest, eventually into northern England and southern Scotland. Ahead of that, some early sunshine, but things will tend to cloud over. A few showers across the far north of Scotland, but here perhaps the best of the sunshine in between those showers. But to the south and the southwest, we start to see some warm and humid air wafting its way in. And as we move out of Wednesday into Thursday, these frontal systems still wriggle around across central and particularly northern parts of the UK. To the south of these weather fronts, though, we increasingly draw the air up from the southwest. This will be mild and humid air, and it is likely to bring us some pretty high temperatures as we head towards the end of the week. But fortunes are decidedly mixed as we look towards next weekend. Parts of the south up into the middle 20s Celsius. Further north and west, there's likely to be some rain at times.